Good morning. Oh, a talkative crowd. Great. Welcome to the International Jade Summit. My name is Jordan, and I will be your host today. Before we get started, I would love to know, do we have any jewelry professionals in the audience? Show of hands. Fantastic. Excellent. Any lapidaries, any jade carvers? Oh, very enthusiastic. I love it. And then, crazy question. Does anybody here feel particularly strongly about jade as a gemstone? Oh, everyone? Okay, great. So I'm in the right place then. So our first presentation will be from renowned jade artist, Georg Schmerholz. Georg is a professional sculptor who started working with jade in 1992. Starting in 2007, jade carving became Georg's specialty and passion. Since working in jade, he has co-founded the Monterey Bay Jade Festival, won gold and silver awards at Zhigong Bay Jade Competition in Suzhou, China, and released a book of his work entitled Jade, a Sculptural Medium, which you can purchase at his booth number 31 outside at the festival. Georg has requested that if you have a question, please don't wait until the end. Just raise your hand and ask your question during the presentation as it may pertain to particular works on the screen. We're going to take a short 10-minute break after his seminar in case anyone needs to refill their coffee or use the restroom, but we'll open up that time for questions if you have some more then. Out of respect for our speakers and fellow jade enthusiasts in the audience, we ask that you please silence your phones and remain seated for the duration of the presentation. And of course, no flash photography during the seminars. And without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Georg Schmerholz.
Welcome to all of you. I am honored to be invited to make this presentation. Thank you, Jordan, by the way, for the introduction. She mentioned that I'm the co-founder of the Monterey Bay Jade Festival, which obviously this wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for a person who I need to mention as a preface, that his vision, hard work, and enthusiasm and love for jade, Rudy Estrada, who was my partner, is my good friend, close friend, and a patron, that he and I co-founded the festival. So Rudy is in the back, sitting on the top row there. So having said that, let's get into it. You may wonder why I titled my presentation Jade, a Sculptural Medium. The short answer is because I published a book by that name, which Jordan mentioned already. But seriously, let's just get into, there's a book. It's two books in one. The back part of the book chronicles my journey from Transylvania throughout the Western world, ended up in Canada and United States, and how my sculpture work evolved through the years. And that's what we're going to look at as part of the presentation. So here's a list of topics that we're going to cover today. What is sculpture? Sculpture influence in the jade arts, combining other media with jade, going beyond tradition, being innovative, developing an individual style in one's work. And my intention to illustrate these ideas, sharing my own artistic journey while enhancing presentation with subjects such as culture, science, philosophy, and art and psychology. I was born Hungarian in Transylvania, Romania. I left in 1969, consequently lived in Italy, Sweden, Canada, and currently in the Sierra foothills east of Sacramento. I'm sure you're familiar with discussion of nature versus nurture when it comes to development of children. Same reasoning can be applied to artists, how artists come into being. Are they born or are they made? My experience is that it is a little bit of both. The influence of a birth culture and environment becomes a primal nurturing of emerging artists with the additional of formal education in the arts, which I did not have. With an autodidactic learning, although slower than the formal training, I avoided direct influence of a teacher or an artistic trend. So in a way, I evolved slowly, but stayed true to my vision of what art should be, what carving is, and so on and so forth. I avoided direct influence, it allowed me to express natural sense of aesthetics based on age-old tradition of wood carving in birth province of Transylvania. You can see some of the traditional carvings that still being practiced in the mountains of Transylvania. The formal schooling that I did have was classical music and 2 years of engineering university, which later helped me to undertake large projects requiring technical knowledge beyond artistic scope. So clearly my early cultural influence was about working in wood. So here are some of my early, talking 1975, 76, while living in Vancouver and working up in Whistler, which eventually became an international ski resort. Some additional works in wood. I started to be very interested in expressing essence of people, faces. So it was a process of eventually expanding into many other subjects in the sculpture field. So living in Romania, I saw diverse cultural influences of the places I lived in: Italy, Sweden, and west coast of Canada, where I became a sculptor by profession in the mid-'80s. Travel proved to be a great teacher and inspiration. If you've seen, initially I studied in wood, later expanding in soft stone, marble, granite, bronze, and many years later, jade. So if you have any questions, any of the pieces as to what material they are, please ask. I've got into wildlife this was the first commission of a humpback whale and calf, which became actually a major focus, wildlife, marine life, later on. Also explore many different subjects, which I divided into 3 categories: figurative, wildlife, and abstract works. Marble, bronze, another marble piece. Also studied to combine different material, bronze sculpture on a natural stone base. Science. During the creation of 2 large granite sculptures from a 20-ton block and a 25-ton block, respectively, I realized that although I studied the anatomy of my subject extensively, ultimately it's the shape. It's not the shape itself that guides me, but something beyond the form. And I'm going to go back for a second. Oh, there. The first experience that relates to this subject was as I was blocking out the salmon. Basically, the design is a bald eagle and a salmon, and right at this stage, after the salmon was blocked out, it was time to get a little bit more detailed. And I spent some time, made sure that, because once you make a cut, you can't put it back. And not wanting to make a mistake after a year of working on it, I was confident that whatever I was going to remove we left the envelope, the shape intact. And no sooner I made those cuts, I was horrified. I thought I screwed it up. So it was next morning, I had a horrible night. Next morning, went out to the back of the studio where I was working, and I look at it and I go, what are you talking about? There's nothing wrong with this. So this experience was the first that eventually led up to some additional ideas. So this was a second large project out of a 25-ton block granite. It was commissioned, a humpback whale and calf that is downtown Toronto currently, was commissioned as a public art piece for the Standard Life Insurance Company's Toronto headquarters. So before the sculpture was shipped, I had an opening at my studio, and someone came up to me and said, "George, how do you know when to stop?" And I thought about it. Well, it's an excellent question. And later, I realized that, as I say here, I theorized that all materials based on the shape, size, color, texture, and other properties would have a particular energetic expression, energetic field. I mean, this whole concept evolved from those two experiences. I thought if we change any of the properties that can be changed, it stands to reason that its energetic signature would also change, and that is what I respond to as I develop the form. It's almost like reading the frequency. And as you're well aware, that more and more acknowledgement of everything is energy, everything is a resonance, is now a widespread accepted form of quantum physics, quantum theory. Nikola Tesla stated over 100 years ago that everything is energy, frequency, and vibration, which validated my perception. Years later, I came across a theoretical physicist, David Bohm's assertion that the nature of reality is an emergence from an implicate or enfolded into the explicate or unfolded. This reinforced my tendency to leave some parts of the undefined natural medium from which the finished sculpture transitions into form, showing the connection between these two realms. Philosophy. Let us go back to the definition of what sculpture is. Michelangelo, the greatest sculptor of all time, stated that true sculpture is one that is created by a subtractive process, i.e. carving. Jade certainly qualifies. But the word carving is not only a verb, but also a noun that is normally used to describe small-scale jade works, so size is a factor, whether something qualifies as a sculpture or stays as a carving, which doesn't diminish its value. Also, traditional jade carving tends to be more two-dimensional relief works rather than full three-dimensional. Consequently, the scope of a creation would make it sculptural versus a carving. Now, a lot of the new younger carvers are coming around and doing some fabulous, fabulous three-dimensional small sculptural works. In alignment with the subtractive process, I adopted as my motto a statement by the French philosopher Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. A friend of mine collected this is late 90s, where just getting into computers, and he sent out a questionnaire to all his friends and said, "Send me your favorite quote." He compiled it and sent it back to everybody. And as I was reading it, I came across this statement, and I said, this is it. This is what I feel my work is about. Perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, which is an additive process like modeling clay, but when there's nothing left to take away. So in other words, when you carve, you take things away, slowly reveal what's already exists. And that's what Michelangelo stated, that the finished sculpture exists already within the form. So all the sculptor needs to do is remove that which covers it up. But you can't put it back. So that's where when you reach that level of finish and form, where there's anything more that you take away that will diminish the work. But if more is there, you can't add on. So it's a fine balance. This means finding the balance between details and a broad form, where anything more will not add to the sculpture, but anything less will diminish it. This is a bronze eagle, life-size bald eagle in bronze. That's a marble tidal nesting. And then this happened. A sculpture, this perhaps more than any other, has been the most influential changing the creative direction of my career. Many years ago, I was offered a large Douglas fir, that's a misspell there, a root from the excavation of a high-rise building. It was suggestive of a stylized bird form with the potential of two chicks in the center. Although it was relatively well preserved, critical parts were the heads and the part of the left wing had rotted out. Then the idea struck me to complete the missing section in bronze. This introduced me to the magic of integrating multiple media in a single piece. It's about 36 inches tall, so you get a sense of its size. And truly, this, to me, looking back, it is the most influential piece that I've ever done. Others soon followed in terms of combining bronze with rhodonite, crystal with bronze. These are a couple of portraits of kids.
Question?
Yes?
So when you combine different, materials,
Yeah.
Does that free you from like, well, I made a mistake, so I could just fix it with
I talk about, I think a little later, I talk about how my vision is, it's both visual and energetic, sense of energetic combination. It's like composing music, intuitively understanding what the quality of the frequency of one material versus another, and how these two frequencies or sounds or energies will integrate. So I have a sense ahead of time. It just intuitively it comes. What material should I combine it with? So it's hard to explain, but your question is very valid. My very first jade project was a commission for a 7-foot-tall figure, at the time the largest jade sculpture in the world, of Guanyin, for the Wat Dhamma Mongol Buddhist temple in Bangkok, Thailand. This was the second figure to be carved out of a 35-ton boulder sourced by Jade West in British Columbia. And if most of you know, or a lot of you know, Kirk Makepeace, I've been friends with him for 40 years, and he was the one who provided, and it's a long, very interesting story of how this project came about. Unfortunately, for reasons, I couldn't really finish the project, but I was there for 4 months working on it. Took 12 years after the Guanyin project for me to return to jade. In the meantime, I lived in Vancouver at the time, eventually moved down to California, and so it took 12 years. After the Guanyin project, for me to return, while walking around a jade West yard looking for inspiration in the rough, I literally tripped on a badly fractured piece of polar jade, partially embedded in mud. A piece that no carver worth his grinder would touch, let alone try to do something with it. It cried out to me, "I'm also beautiful, take me with you." I did, and within a week, it revealed to me what it wanted to become. And my first jade and bronze sculpture was born, heart to heart. They pinned and bonded mechanically. Excuse me. Initially, it appeared that working with jade was to become just an extension of what I had been doing in other media in the previous 30-some years. But in very short order, it became clear that jade in fact, my true medium. Amongst all that I worked with, offering unparalleled creative expression and technical challenges. This was the first in a series of 3 called Child. Actually, the title of this, Babushka. Babushka is a term in Russian terms of an old lady with a scarf. So I played on the word baby, babushka. So what inspires me to combine different media in a single sculpture? Music. I mean the music of resonance and vibration, which I've talked about already. As the fundamental nature of all matter is energetic, depending on its various properties, objects resonate at different frequencies, just as various instruments do. Altering the size, shape, surface texture, and details of a piece affects the resonance of the whole. And when these frequencies align with an original energetic vision, and this is kind of answers your question, the creation is complete. My ultimate aim is for the viewer to experience a deeper beauty that exists beyond form. The headdress is a bronze casting of a basalt, rough basalt, patinated with a white patina, again to contrast the beautiful face, the dark face of jade. Jade's importance and meaning to the Chinese culture is best expressed by the saying, gold has value, jade is invaluable. It has brightness like heaven. Its firm substance is born of the mountains and the waters like the earth. Observes Confucius, describing two of the many qualities of jade, also assigned 11 virtues to the stone of heaven. And those of you who real jadeaholics, and you probably heard about this and know about this. The virtue that I feel most affinity with speaks of blemishes and interior flaws show themselves through transparency, call to mind sincerity, and will not obscure its merit and beauty. Interestingly, what developed in current times are two camps in the jade carving space. One that advocates for pure jade, and the other is inspired by the stone with character, as I call it. Back in the olden days, jade artists, jade carvers, looked for character in the stone and worked with that to enhance the design, or looked at jade at head and looked at what the stone itself wanted to become, to express that flaw. I call it character.
Can you talk more about, like you said, jade is your chosen material. Is it the handling of the material, or is it the final product?
Jade is a stone of completion.
What was the question?
Oh, sorry, yeah. Say that again.
It was the material as he's working it, or is it the final product of the material that made him feel he was drawn to the material?
So what he was asking is it this final material that draws me to jade, or the jade as being my favorite or my real medium, actually neither. It is the quality of its resonance. Jade is called as the stone of heaven. It integrates the higher realm to the earthly realm. So it's the integration, so it's a completion stone. So it has a frequency of being a high resonance stone, and that's why it's been used for over 8,000 years in China. And for Chinese culture, stone is, in fact, and correct me, some of your Chinese, hi there. The jade, the word, the symbol of jade is incorporated, and correct me if I'm wrong, incorporated in the symbol of China. Is that correct? Yeah. So that's how important. And that doesn't come from just being, beautiful or being tough. It comes from a frequency, spiritual resonance, and I'm going to mention that a little bit later. So that's why I feel such an affinity with jade. And in fact, when I did my first jade project, the Guanyin, partially, and perhaps the reason it didn't work out, many reasons, but one of it, perhaps I wasn't quite ready to channel the frequency of jade. Amongst all the jade aficionados, including miners, hunters, gemologists, dealers, collectors, and many of you are represented by these persons, carvers, the last group is afforded the privilege to truly feel and experience intimately the timeless magic and mystery of this stone. It is mysterious. So, example of how using character stone in a design, how it will influence the design. This is a piece of Siberian, and it has layers of different colors. And you see how I've integrated that. And it's a megalodon shark tooth that's combined with representing Hathor, the Egyptian goddess Hathor, which represented, it's a cow with horns and a sun disk in between the horns. So but what is this almost mythical allure that nephrite and jadeite share that stirs the soul of ancient cultures to a level of devotion of the Chinese, Mesoamerican, and the Maori? It is convergence of physical character, sensory experience, aesthetic beauty, and spiritual enhancing power of a living substance rather than a mere stone. So this is what I was alluding to. In 2014, a group of us were invited first time from the West to exhibit at the Zigambe jade competition in Suzhou. And this was one of the pieces that I submitted. The third of that series of babies with a swaddle out of a Siberian white jade. While polishing the jade component of this piece, I had an insight that the various media I worked in over the years was a direct reflection of a lifelong inner transformation, progressing from wood in my early days as a sensitive, impressionable young man, through soft stones, then marble, granite, metal, leading to jade, one of the hardest media, yet the softest to the touch when polished, and the most responsive to the light. This confirmed me the jade's spiritual enhancing influence, something ancient sages understood so well. So it wasn't just a utilitarian, well, it started as a utilitarian stone, but its beauty and resonance eventually turned it into this amazing, mystical, spiritual material. Excuse me. Art and psychology. Carving wood, marble, granite, and jade, like any creative expression, is both craft and art. We know what it takes to be a good craftsman. You need to know the medium, have the right tools, have certain skills which most artisans can acquire to varying degrees. But what constitutes art in an age when just about anything can be called, and unfortunately is called, art? The answer remains debatable, except for one consensus, that art is a subjective experience for anyone who creates it or appreciates it. My definition of art is very narrow, which is when the finished work transcends both the object and the subject.
Is the white painted? Or
The war paint on the face? No. It's super finely textured based on the particular design that it's a portrait of, actually. I don't think Rudy will mind that he commissioned me. He is half Yaqui, Native American. And he's been supporting me for many, many years. And he commissioned a portrait of him. This is a little bit 60% life size as a chieftain. And he picked the particular design of the war paint. And so I textured it, super finely textured it to create that painted effect. We speak of inspired art. What does that mean? It means in spirit. In other words, art that is created from a state of presence carry an energy frequency that can be awakened the same dimension of consciousness in the viewer. Just think about that. That's what inspired art is, when something stops you and because you resonate. I mean, we even use the term, I resonate with the work. So that again, that alludes to the fact that there is an energetic, strong energetic component to everything, not just art, but to everything and everyone. But when we resonate with the work, it means that it has a deep influence, deep impact on us and changes our view. If this is true, then the importance of presence, a state of unconditioned awareness, cannot be overstated, as it is the gateway to an unlimited creative field and to a connection to source itself. Now we're getting into a little bit of the spiritual discourse. What is source? What is the undefined? And so we speak of having a connection. Where do artists get their ideas? So the state of presence is when you in flow. It just comes. You look at a stone, it tells you what it wants to become. Or you have an idea and it flows. It's really, it doesn't come from you, it comes through you. And the more conscious you become of that fact, the flow becomes stronger and more immediate. And as a consequence, art can become a nonverbal spiritual teacher, pointing at a deeper reality beyond the world of form. Opposing that on the other side is the world of the formless, the undefined source. However, even inspired creations come into reality through individuation, i.e., through the unique personal attributes of the artist, his, her emotional, mental, and aesthetic makeup, including his physical looks. Even Michelangelo's babies and Madonnas carry a resemblance of his features. Here's a bronze portrait of him. Psychology calls it projection. It's almost unavoidable. So here's an example of Michelangelo, portraits of him, illustrations of him, and his work. In fact, this is the third in the series of the babies. And my beloved, who is sitting in the back, Cecile, she thinks that the baby looks like me. So you be the judge. So yes, you could take someone off the street who never done any art or any sculpture or anything and give them a lump of clay or a piece of marble. Give them a chisel and say, to the best of your ability, fashion a face or a head. I guarantee you that as unanatomical incorrect that face will be, it will be striking the resemblance of that person. So when you do portraiture, an artist does portraiture, particularly sculpture, is very difficult to take yourself out of that picture. Oftentimes I see a portrait, commissioned portrait, a sculptor stands next to it, bronze or stone, and I look at the sculptor and I look at the stone and said, half of him is in there, or more than half. So it's very difficult to not have you involved in that respect. So in this perspective, art becomes a mirror in which we can discover who we are on the deepest level, and it is one of the main reasons why art is so important. So what is magical in the master's work? I believe it is that they found their own voice, their unique expression of who they are beyond cultural traditions and what we ultimately strive for. I made a presentation in Suzhou and talked about, you have the best jade artists in the world in China, particularly Master Chu, who is considered a living treasure, Chinese treasure. And that's what I found in their work. They all unique style, yet There's an expression, there's a fluidity. There's no struggle in the work. When you look at it, it's like, it's fluid. It looks so easy. So that comes from having fully integrated who you are and expressing it through the work. In architecture, the core principle used to be form follows function. In these days, it seems the opposite, where function follows form. I feel it should be about the integration of the two concepts, a concept I intend to explore. So integrating different media, also integrating beauty with function. And as we know, jade started as a functional material and ended up being a beauty. So going back to its roots as a utilitarian medium, but turning into art. Okay, yeah, good. Well, this is, for instance, this is a British Columbian jade, polar jade, and the form, the mountain form as such is actually a bronze casting of a walnut burl, which had natural holes through it. And a friend of mine, a woodworker, gave me the piece, said, George, you can do something with this. And literally within 10 minutes, it was sitting on the passenger side. I was driving and kept looking at it and said, oh my God. And so created this piece, called it Dragon's Lair. And of course, men will look at it and said, how did you actually feed the jade through? And of course, I have two answers. One is that I prepared the bronze casting. I left the jade on the bench for a long weekend, came back, and the dragon found its way. It's 23 inches long and found its way through. That's one question. The other answer is that under tremendous heat and pressure, jade becomes malleable. I mean, that's how jade is formed. So I found a way of actually turning jade into soften the jade and feed it through. So you pick your guess. For instance, even a common item such as a spoon or a pair of chopsticks can be elevated by using the medium of jade and then personalize their symbolism while still maintaining the actual utilitarian function. This is a fully functional jade spoon and a jade spoon rest out of Wyoming jade, Wyoming olive, and representing the dragon and the phoenix in Chinese cosmology. I've been working with the dragon and the phoenix. I have quite a few of this subject that I love to explore, but it's fully functional. Here's the chopsticks. Common utensil used by probably a third of the world population, reinterpreted as the dragon and the phoenix in Chinese cosmology, symbolizing the emperor and the empress of old. Guatemalan jadeite. And again, you see the discoloration of the head, the crest. Again, that's just the rind. I love jade rind and incorporate it as much as possible. Even in subtle. There's a saying, most of you are familiar with, the devil is in the detail. I say, yeah, that might be right, might be true. But God is in the subtleties. The basis is white Carrara marble. Jade's utilitarian origin proves endless inspiration for artistic interpretation. A very rare Guatemalan rainbow luna jade for the blade, and the handle is antler, deer antler. And again, he is a Siberian jade, almost looks really, really old, a little bit coarse, with a handle. Whole thing looks antique, and I call it the last emperor's spoon. Or to illustrate a Maya legend, this dagger is actually representative of the quetzal bird of Guatemala, which is the national bird. And there's a legend of the last Mayan warrior prince who went into battle with the Spaniards, followed by his spirit guide, a quetzal bird. And he was slain, and the bird landed on his chest and rubbed itself into his blood. So the male quetzal has this crimson red chest. And you look at the blade, it has the beautiful flowing long tail of the quetzal bird. The red is a very special cold patina that I use on the bronze. The blade and the head is a green, the eyes is black guatemalan, and the beak is a yellow guatemalan, all jadeite. Even the base has a metal plate, but the bottom there's a piece of guatemalan, like a dark green, almost black guatemalan jadeite. Jade allows sculpture to take form as a wearable art. And when I joined the jade scene, I met some of the best carvers from New Zealand. And one of them who inspired me, he was into dragons. And I said, by the name of Don Salt, most of you know of him. And it really inspired me. And I said, I want to do a dragon. He said, George, you got to find your own dragon. Because he had his own particular style of dragon. And so on the way home, I stopped at a bookstore and I spent about $300 on books on dragon culture. And by next year, going back to Tucson, exhibition, group show, I said, I got to do this dragon. And I came up with this idea. What about a neck torque? And so that was the beginning of this whole concept of a torque in jade. It's Cucho, British Columbian Cucho jade. It's one of the 3 locations in British Columbia that produces different type of jade. Or sculptural medium, medallions. I love the B-disc form. It's a natural, that's another long story. I don't know if you have time, probably not. This was a commission piece in Siberian jade. That one, which I still have, is Guatemalan jadeite with a megalodon shark tooth. I call it sea wolf. One-of-a-kind pendants, feathers, Siberian, Wyoming. More sculptural pieces in combination with bronze. The jade is from Quebec. In fact, I'm working on a large piece now. The Musée du Jade in Quebec City is giving me a show in October, a one-year show. The Chosen One, titled The Chosen One, polar jade, British Columbian polar jade. You see how the balance or connecting the jade with the bone, with the skull, is a silver ring. This is also for the museum. It's called mating call. A rare cinder nephrite from Wyoming with gold horns, a bison. This is one thing that I want to explore more. I call it spirit guides, where I take the jade like a specimen and just carve into it, just enough to reveal something emerging. In my most recent work, The Apple of My Eyes, also for Quebec, for the museum, a bronze casting of a branch. And then the family that owns the museum have an apple orchard. So this was to honor that and the title of The Apple of My Eyes, using their jade. And that's all she wrote. If you have any questions, thank you.
We know it's no secret that demand for jade is growing. You can see it when you walk outside into the festival. Younger customers have become entranced by it. And both of the jades, nephrite jade and jadeite jade have piqued the interests of artists and designers in the West. We're seeing more variety in jade products in 2026. There's contemporary jewelry designs, artistic carvings like we saw from George, and even home decor items. But these things are not new, not really. Historically speaking, jade was celebrated as more than jewelry for as long as it was mined. In China, jade was used for music and for ritual, and it was part of the royals' daily lives. Emperors slept on jade pillows and ate from jade bowls. Empresses had jade beads sewn into their clothing. The Mayans built entire trade routes to move jade, selling it not just as jewelry, but as tools and weapons, plaques, and sculptures. The instinct to decorate one's life and home with jade is not new. In fact, it seems to just be natural for those who have been so fortunate as to have access to jade. Whether it's to honor a family member, a religion, or a memory, this type of ornamentation connects us to people all throughout history. The tradition of possessing decorative jades is about to see an uptick in the US market, and for that we have our next speaker to thank. William Ralston-Saul has come to us all the way from England, but his mining operation happens to be in Kazakhstan. William is the acting COO of Jade Resources Limited, which owns the Itmarendi Jade Deposit in Kazakhstan, the world's largest known jadeite deposit, and he is also the co-founder and CEO of Jade Vault Limited. His focus is on building a legally traceable jade supply chain into China and making innovative products outside the traditional categories of jade for the international market. Please welcome William Ralston-Saul.
Take that off there. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for coming to listen to me speak. I've had quite a few people come up to me saying they're really excited to hear me talk about Kazakh jade. And I'm really excited to tell you about Kazakh jade, but I will warn you in advance. Despite spending 25 years in the mining industry, I'm the world's worst geologist and I'm an awful mineralogist, okay? So go easy on me with the questions on that front, but you can always try. So today, it's been very interesting for me, or just generally the American jade experience, because I have really, all my involvement with jade has been mining in Kazakhstan, and it's been manufacturing and selling in China. And I'd never really thought about coming to America to do jade stuff. And I reached out to Jordan, I can't remember when it was, maybe a couple of years ago, and she's extremely enthusiastic and full of energy, and convinced us to come to Tucson, which we did, and we loved it. And we met the North American jade community, and it was like incredibly sort of energizing, because what's so special here is it's still small. In China, it's a $16 billion industry. It's so big, in fact, in China, that after diamonds, jadeite is the second most traded gemstone in the world in terms of monetary value. Whereas here, it's much smaller. And you get the feeling here, or it is a feeling here, that everybody here is jade's growing, nephrite jade's growing, jadeite jade's growing. It's becoming more popular in the US, but it's still small enough that it feels like it's grassroots. And what you get with any community of extremely enthusiastic and passionate people building something and growing something and talking about something that they all love is you get that like fantastic community spirit where everybody's trying to help everybody. And it's brilliant, because it is quite literally the total opposite of what it can be like doing business in the jade industry in China. But so I'm going to bring some of that. I'm going to show you maybe what it looks like from the other side as well. Something else I want to go through today is obviously I'm going to talk about the Kazakh jade, because I know you've come to hear about that. I'm going to talk a bit about my past, how I got involved in it, talk a bit about Central Asia, because it's a fascinating place. And I'm sure that most of you have never been to Central Asia before. So let's get started. Oh, there we go. All right, already screwed up on the clicker. Okay, all right. So Central Asia. Central Asia was part of the Soviet Union. And it includes lots of countries that end in stan. Kazakhstan being the biggest of all. So Kazakhstan is the size of Western Europe. It's absolutely enormous, and it's totally landlocked. It also happens to be the biggest uranium producer in the world, and it has huge copper reserves, and to some extent, still largely unexplored. There's then the other stans, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and they were all part of the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, they all became independent states. And some of them did better than others. So if you go through Central Asia, there is actually a jade history to it, which I'll come on to because it's more ancient than what we're talking about here. But what's interesting about it is it's been invaded by just about anybody and everybody that could. Alexander the Great was in Central Asia. He actually found his wife, Roxana, in Central Asia. There was a Persian invasion of Central Asia, and as a result, in Tajikistan, they actually speak Persian, yet it's written in Cyrillic alphabet. And then there was an Arab invasion, and that brought the Muslim religion to Central Asia. Then Genghis Khan came through and probably killed quite a lot of people. Then you had the Russians, who took it in 1717, and they gradually started to take over the Kazakh steppe and then took over the whole thing. And during that period, you had the British Empire, and we were in India, and the Russians were north, and you had Afghanistan and Central Asia as this sort of buffer zone in between. And there's this great book, which I highly recommend reading, called The Great Game, and it talks about these, stories of these essentially spies and adventurers who would go into Central Asia to try and essentially play the great game, playing Russia off against the British Empire. Most of them ended up being thrown into various torturous pits and eaten by bugs over periods of 3 years and all kinds of weird and horrible things. But it was a fascinating period of time in history. Anyway, that all ended when the British had one of the worst defeats in history, which was when they were retreating from Afghanistan with 16,000 soldiers, and only one person made it out, which was the doctor. So that was, you could say, more or less the end of the Great Game. This was then followed by the Soviet Union. And what was interesting about the Soviet Union is, from a geology point of view, they drilled and trenched and tested just about everything. So there's all kinds of deposits of all kinds of minerals across the former Soviet Union that underwent all kinds of testing, and lots of things where you're just like, that would never happen in the Western world because nobody would ever finance it, nobody would ever pay for it. But it didn't work like that then. It worked differently. You had a budget, and if it said spend your budget, you spent your budget, and that was it. And then they're independent, and you have what's called the CIS. Okay, I'm pointing out the wrong place. So just a few fun facts about Central Asia, one that I particularly like. In Tajikistan, there's a lake called Lake Sarez. It is an artificial lake. It was created, an earthquake happened in 1911. Basically, an entire mountain fell down and blocked a river, and it created a lake. Now, this lake is held up by this dam of unknown strength, and we are talking about a region where there's 4,000 earth tremors a year, and then occasionally a very large earthquake. If that dam collapses, and this is somebody told me the fact in this exact way, the first villages will be hit 30 minutes later by a wall of water that's the height of one of the Great Pyramids, traveling at the speed of a running cheetah. Within 24 hours, up to 5 million people will be dead. An inland tsunami of cataclysmic scale, the largest natural disaster that could happen in the world. So yeah, there's a fun fact. And that is the lake right there. Tajikistan, where I lived for 13 years, is 96% mountains. So I spent my whole life pretty much there in the mountains. As a result, quite keen not going to the mountains too much anymore. The largest glacier in the world that's a non-polar one is inside Central Asia as well. The apple and the rose come from there. Every single country in Central Asia will claim that the apple came from their country specifically, but it did come from that area. And then the most important fact of all, if you've all seen Rambo 3, where he plays that game where he drags a dead goat around on a horse and tries to put it into a bucket, that is actually a real game. It's called Bushkashi. I took this photo, that hairy thing hanging off the horse there, that is a dead goat. It's a very, very violent game indeed. Okay, so how did I start off in Central Asia? Well, my dad sent me to Central Asia, to Tajikistan specifically, when I was 18 years old. We didn't have digital cameras back then, but I did dig out a couple of photos at 3 o'clock this morning while I was putting this presentation together. So that was actually my second day. You can see that I'm not American because I'm slightly uncomfortable with the way I'm holding my Kalashnikov. Anyway, these two characters next to me, they assassinated the Minister of Culture 2 weeks later and then did life in prison. So they were some interesting guys. And this is me next to a burnt out tank that had been taken out essentially in the Tajik civil war. So in Tajikistan, they had a civil war that went on for a very long time. And unfortunately, 60,000 people died. And I arrived in the country at the very end of that. So arriving in Central Asia, a former Russian country, the first thing you have to learn how to do is drink. Now, I was a cocky 18-year-old. I thought I knew how to drink. I was sorely, sorely mistaken indeed. I had to relearn how to drink when I got there. My most memorable case is when I went to the bank to ask for a loan. By this time, we had a gold shipment going out. And the bank manager arrived at 11 o'clock in the morning. I said, I need a loan. He was called Mr. Agashov. And he says, yeah, that's fine. You can have a loan. As long as you sit down and have a drink with me and the owner of the vodka factory. He poured me half a liter of vodka into one glass. And he said, right, you can drink that in one go and you get your loan, or you can get out of my office. And that was it. 3 hours later, I crawled out of his office, but I did get the loan. So moving on, within a couple of years in Tajikistan, I was actually working in the gold mining industry. And because nobody really wanted to work there, and I was working with my dad at the time, he said, you stay there and I'll stay in England and try and organize the money to get a mine built. And I actually ended up running it, which was crazy because I didn't really know what I was doing. So by the age of 21, I had about 700 people working for me. And this was our first cyanide plant where we were processing gold. And that was my first gold bar, our first gold bar that got poured. So that was my kind of experience of getting into the mining industry. 3 open pit gold mines, 1 centralized plant, and doing some processing. That, unfortunately, had a bit of a sad ending because we didn't own the mine. But anyway, moving on from there, we did decide we would get our own mine. So being complete idiots, we decided to pick a coal mine at 13,000 feet. This is the Comrod coal mine. And we had to build a road 40 kilometers to get to that coal mine in an area about 100 kilometers north of the Afghan border. So that was my next challenge. We did this. Everybody's head's been cut off, which is actually quite common in that area of the world. But not. It actually wasn't meant to be like this on the picture. But anyway, that's me and the motley crew getting started to build the road. Everything that could go wrong trying to build a road like this literally went wrong. We had a 120-foot bridge collapse on the way in. That's a picture. That's Bobby, who used to work with me. He's 6'3", so that gives you some idea of how deep the snow is. And that was the snow just on the side of the road while we were plowing through. And this is how we treat our customers. So it's fine. They got out. But yeah, trucks did occasionally go over the edge. This is how we lived. So we were building the road. We actually had to get over 2 mountains before we even got to the coal mountain. That was the kitchen. And 2 or 3 of my very good friends. And as you can see, it was generally quite a cold and miserable experience. We did eventually get to the mine. That's me standing on the mine looking back, and you can see the road winding along the mountains there. And that's in the middle of the summer. So that really, really was quite an adventure. And eventually, we got there, and we started mining coal. And it was great. And what was even greater is somebody came along, a Chinese company, and bought all the mines. And then I decided to run away because I was exhausted and tired. And this is me with my sister, Clarissa. If you go outside to our stand, you'll see Clarissa out there. We worked together for 25 years. And really, at that point, I think I was so sort of traumatized by all the stresses the mining industry created for me that I said, I'm never going back. That's it. I'm done. I'm going for the easy life now. And I did manage to do that for a while. But then something came along that I wasn't expecting. Jade came into my life. So I was going along with life in a very normal way. And in 2022, somebody who I used to work with, a guy called Kevin Fu, who is the owner of the jade mine in Kazakhstan, he called me up one day and he said his business partner had got very ill and he needed some help and he needed me to get involved in the jade mine with him. My first reaction was absolutely not going mining, not going to Central Asia, not doing any of it ever again. And then he said, well, do you mind if I just send you the geological maps? And I am, despite being a really bad geologist in terms of understanding the different minerals, if somebody gives me a map, that's a completely different thing because I'm more of an engineering type person and I'm a sucker for a map. And so he sent me the map of the Idmarundi jadeite deposit in Kazakhstan. And that was really the beginning of it. Now, to start with, I just looked at it from, well, it's worth more than coal, which is what I used to mine. That was about how romantic I got about it. And I was like, yeah, I quite like it. I mean, I like the green bits, and I like this. But jade has this funny way of sneaking up on you. And then you kind of get more into it. And then you start looking at other people's jade. And you're like, oh, I wish that was my bit of jade. And stuff like this. So, yeah, I've basically got the bug big time now. But it was one of those things that I didn't, because I think, a lot of people are probably really enthusiastic about jade and then maybe end up mining jade. I did it completely in the opposite way to that. So coming back to a bit of Central Asian history, because, I had no idea really about the jade industry, despite the fact I was bought out by a Chinese company. I did work for them for 2 years. I spent time in China. I saw people wearing jade. And I could never understand why in the market there was a translucent green bangle that cost $20 and why some idiot down the road was paying $100,000 for something that looks exactly the same. I was like, oh, don't they know it's like cheaper down there? Well, of course, I had no idea about fake jade or synthetic stuff or anything. I didn't know anything. But it all, as I started to learn about jade, it all became more clear. And then I started to learn that actually, not that Kazakh jade, okay, was a new thing in terms of it. We haven't heard of Kazakh jade before, but actually jade was brought from Central Asia thousands of years ago, and for thousands of years it happened. So you've got these three trade routes, these three jade trade routes. So I'm sure you've all heard of the Silk Road. Well, essentially there was the Jade Road, and pretty much this one, the Eurasian one, that was the same route, or one of the same routes. And this went on, it's been going on 5,000 years ago. And so in the Han Dynasty, when the emperors, that's when they were mad about jade, the jade burial suits and stuff. I mean, they've always been mad about jade, but that was a particularly extra enthusiastic period. It's actually, a lot of jade was the Hutian nephrite, which came from Western China. And I've spent a lot of time in Western China. I've visited a lot of the stuff there. But some of it even came from further afield. They've done the various mineralogy testing, whatever the technical word for it is. And they've actually discovered that nephrite jade came from Tajikistan and other places in Central Asia. So there was historically a jade route that came from Central Asia. So I'm feeling now we're bringing Kazakhstan, it's not that it's essentially a new source, we're bringing an old source back. And in some ways, somebody always told me I was never a precious stone miner, but a friend of mine is a precious stone miner, who said the most important thing with a precious stone is having a good story with a precious stone. And I think this is a great story, that this is kind of the comeback of a very, very old and ancient thing that happened before. So that is a map, or one of the maps of it. So, all right, I'm going to use a pointer for the first time. Over here, this is. So you got Samarkand. I don't know if you guys have heard of Samarkand. That's in Uzbekistan now. because the borders moved, Stalin moved all the borders around. And then you've got Kashgar here, which is one of the most western cities in China. And then you've got Urumqi here, which is the biggest city in Xinjiang province. So basically, you know, and these were the routes. Now, these are actually the Silk Route maps, because nobody's actually made. I couldn't find on the internet a very good picture of the jade route maps, but essentially they're the same routes. So the jade would travel from this area and come through and essentially make it over to Eastern China, where all the emperors were, or the emperor's family, essentially. So it's some good history. Okay, now I appreciate everybody in this room's probably got more knowledge about jade than me, so I don't want to teach you stuff you already know, but I think sometimes it's interesting just to look at things all on one page. And I know that nephrite is particularly dominant in the US, so maybe some of this information will be new information. But what you have going on really in the jadeite world is, and it's always been the case in the jadeite world, is you have Burma being extremely dominant, or Myanmar, depending on what you call it. They produce 90+% probably of the entire jadeite that's produced, because so much of it is unofficial and doesn't get recorded and gets smuggled. It's very hard to know exactly how much, but you can just tell when you're in China that most of it is coming in from Burma. But what you're also noticing is there is more and more Guatemalan material in the Chinese market. Now, I know that a lot of that's smuggled in, so I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I'm just observing what is actually happening, right? That you're noticing that, and that seems to be an increasing thing. So you've got Burma, you've got Guatemala, and they're really totally dominant in terms of jadeite production. Those two countries. And then you've got Kazakhstan, the new kid, that's us, all right? So we're starting to bring in material. And then I did an exercise the other day. I actually started to look to see, I was interested whether I could find another source of jadeite. I thought it'd be cool. We could have two types of jadeite in the company. And you've got Russia, they've got it, but they've got sanctions. You've got Indonesia, but impossible situation for permitting. So you can't really do anything there. Japan, Greece, and Italy, I can't remember which one's historic sites or nature reserves, but basically off limits. And then you've got some in Iran, and you've got sanctions and a war. And then a little bit in Mongolia. That was the best option of all the ones that I found for a potential another source of jadeite. I mean, it is an incredibly rare thing that jadeite is created geologically, you know, and I do find that fascinating, because nearly every other mineral you can find in some kind of commercial quantities in more than 3 countries. So there we go. Now, Burmese jadeites, what's happening? Well, it depends on who you talk to. They'll tell you probably a different story about what's happening. So I'm just basing it really on my conversations in China. And you have a whole combination of factors that are taking place that are creating issues for production. You've got the Chinese government have clamped down massively on the smuggling. And I've seen this personally, even government organizations that I work with in China, they've been involved in sting operations, even recently, even a couple of months ago, like an area where jade gets auctioned, where I even know the people there, 40 people were arrested in one day. One of the main people who we supply jade to, which is a huge live streaming company, they got audited, and they basically had to say who all their suppliers were. And after that, they were so traumatized that they said, all we really care about is, can you provide receipts, for stuff? All right, are you legitimate? All right, the government is really, really starting to crack down in China on that. Okay, and that, if you're a smuggler, that creates problems. So in Burma, you've also got civil war, which is a big issue. You've got situations with licenses being cancelled because the government might want to preserve jade that they feel is being mined and exported without them getting their taxes because it's been smuggled. And then it's had it's been mined very, very hard, in the last 20 years. It used to be non-mechanized mining, and then it went ultra-mechanized. I've personally never been to Burma, but I've seen enough videos of like highly mechanized mines, really, mines with 500 trucks in them, and huge fleets of Caterpillar and Volvo equipment, like a coal mine kind of level in terms of the volume. And you're mining something that you can't really explore for it, because drilling alluvial pebbles it's basically impossible, right? You just mine rich areas. And so what you've seen is Burmese production drop. I don't actually have any data after 2021. But I'm sure somebody in this room might have some more data, but it's generally a declining thing. Okay, so I've touched on this a little bit already, but what I find interesting, I find interesting that in the US, it's a small market, a small group of very enthusiastic and energetic people, and it's like a niche. It's a niche market. In China, it's the complete opposite. Jade is not a niche market. It's a huge market. It just geographically depends on where you are. And like I said, it's $16 billion a year. This is just jadeite. That's without nephrite in China alone, which is an extraordinary amount. There's a paper called the Industry Development White Paper, which is partly government funded, or is government funded. It's the Gem and Jewelry Trade Association of China. It's published in Chinese, and with the help of AI and some people, we've managed to create a version of that in English. If anybody wants to read that, it's actually quite interesting to see how the Chinese market has changed, because there's been dramatic changes in the Chinese market for jadeite, basically since the beginning of COVID. And one interesting, or very interesting statistic that you get from there is in the jewelry industry, jadeite is now double the size of diamonds. The previous version, so that's the 2024 version of the report, the previous version, which I think was 2021, they were the same size. So part of it's because diamonds are not doing very well, but after gold, it's jadeite, right? It is the main thing in China, which I think is fascinating. The other massive change that's taken place in China is that when they went to COVID, there was lockdown, and they did much more hardcore lockdown than we did. And before that, jade had definitely become something that Granny was wearing jade. Young people were not into jade at all. All the jade markets were physical. You'd go there, you'd buy your stuff. And what happened is these live streaming platforms started to appear. For those, I'm sure you know what live streaming is, but essentially it's like internet selling. It's like the modern version of QVC. QVC mixed with social media, okay? And some of these groups came up very, very quickly, and they started to grab the attention of young people. And the young people, they wanted more modern design. They were more into the pendants than the bangles. They were happy with the lower quality of jade because they couldn't afford the really, really expensive stuff that the older generations could afford. But also, they became more educated about jade being treated. So I'm sure you're familiar with fei shui type A, untreated type B, and type C. Right? So that type B and type C was very, very prevalent. There was generally a lack of education on that front. But now it's very, very strict. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. It does exist. And if you say it's type B, you can do it legally. But much less you're getting that people are saying it's type A or it's untreated when it actually is treated. I mean, the penalties for doing that are actually pretty terrifying. Even in the scrap jade markets, there's signs everywhere, no type B like this. So it's good. I mean, it's a good thing. It's the consumer is starting to get protected in China. And you can see from here is the demographics of the buyers have changed. It used to be old people, and now it's young people. This is an example, a live streamer. This lady here, who I've got to know a little bit, She's called the boss lady of jade, or Lucy to people who know her. She does $750,000 a day in sales. It's extraordinary. She's so good at selling herself that she doesn't even she goes on twice a month now, because when she goes and does a live stream herself, like when she's on the camera, they need 80 backup staff to manage the orders. It is absolutely crazy, basically. And it does seem to be a very strong direction that the market's heading. And I don't know, is Europe and is the US going to head in that direction as well? But it's something to think about, because everybody in this room is either buying jade or selling jade or carving jade. And is that a trend? Is it something that is gonna change? So then, yeah, I've talked about this already, so I'm not going to talk about it again. But the Chinese are really cracking down on the illegal trade. I'm not saying it's going to go away. The legal trade will always be there because there will always be corruption. But it's not like it was before. And there's this organization called the Guangdong Jade Exchange. Well, it's more than an organization. It's actually a jade brokerage. And we work very closely with them. And they're 51% owned by the government, 31% owned by Chow Tai Fook, which is the biggest jewelry brand in China. And they were set up to do exactly this, to gradually put the pressure on and try and legitimize the jade market. So it is changing in China. Okay, back to Kazakh jade. So we've got some pictures that have been cut off, but it's fine. There will be some that aren't. Okay, so Kazakhstan, all right? This is where it is. So this was not such familiar territory for me. I'm a Tajikistan person, but this is where it is. So in Kazakhstan, probably if there's a city that everybody's heard of, it's the old capital, and it's called Almaty. And it's right in the south of the country. So this is where our office is. This is where we fly into. And if you want to get to the mine, which is up there, we drive to the mine. And it's a 10-hour drive. It's extremely flat ground. Most of it highway. I mean, it's boring as hell, but it's easy. It's not like Tajikistan going through the mountains. And so in 10 hours, you come across the west side of Lake Balkhash, and there's a town here called Balkhash, and then an hour and a half outside of the town, you get to the Itmarundi deposit. That dot is actually in the wrong place. It's much closer to the lake. It's about 5 kilometers from the lake, and it's a weird lake because it's salt water on one side and fresh water on the other. And I have absolutely no idea why, but that is what it is. Sometimes in Central Asia, it's just better not to ask. That's what I figure, because the answer rarely makes any sense. So there we go. Okay, so the deposit. This picture shows the deposit. So it's an open pit, which you can see there. And this rock sticking out of the ground is jade, which is kind of extraordinary. And this very over basic drawing on the side really is just saying that we have removed enough overburden now that we have a large outcrop, which sticks about 40 feet in the air. And then there's a lot of it still under the ground as well. Now this stuff in the top, a lot of it has gone through freeze thaw. You're talking about a place where it could be minus 40 in the winter. It could be, I'm talking centigrade, guys, minus 40 to plus 40. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, but that's a really big, that's 80 degrees centigrade temperature swing. So you get, it's quite aggressive on the rock. So what we've actually been mainly busy with is removing the top few meters off the jade, as well as removing the overburden on the outside. And obviously we've taken some good jade while we've been doing that. But we can see certainly in the foot of the monolith, we can see quality improving. That means less cracks. Also nicer color. I think that's more luck than that's got nothing to do with freeze thaw. That wouldn't change the color. But it's certainly interesting. And it is a very large monolith of jade. It's an extraordinary, I don't know, it's a geological miracle maybe, or something like that. So we operate it with a very, very small team. And you could say it definitely fits the bill of ethically sourced jade. You know, it's a small team of 10 people, well-paid 10 people. And we mine the jade a few months of the year. And you could, in theory, mine it all year round. But it's not really necessary because it's you don't really want to be there in the winter. You can mine in the winter, but it's pretty unpleasant. So the mining has commenced. We've started establishing some stockpiles, and we've started exporting the jade into China. So how was it found? Well, I told you that in the former Soviet Union, they did a lot of geology and they looked for a lot of stuff, and this happened to be one of the things they found. They found it in the 50s, and there was a lot of surface outcrops. That's obviously the easier way to find it, and they trenched these surface outcrops, and eventually they essentially picked the area where the surface outcrops were the wider, where it showed the most potential, where the quality was best, and that created the Itmarundi deposit. In the mid-70s, they started to drill it. And they drilled it in the mid-70s, they drilled it in the 80s, and then they drilled again, which was after the Soviet Union. They drilled in 2008. So there's 186 drill holes in the deposit, which is a lot. I think you know, jadeite deposits don't normally get that much geological exploration done on them. And this is a lot of geological exploration. And there's very detailed maps of the deposit, which is fantastic. This is just a fun fact, or maybe a slightly depressing fact, but 3,000 tons of jade was sent to the local copper smelter as flux because of its high silica content. So can you imagine that, guys? that is kind of extraordinary, but you know, that was the Soviet Union. So this is where, don't ask me any questions, but it is very old. Apparently it's 2 to 3 times older than Burmese jadeite. It's a few 100 million years old. That actually, I think, makes it older than the dinosaurs. So it's an old deposit. It is, and then the rest of it, it's in serpentinite. I know that's very common in jade. It's all over the place. That's the host material, and it's sitting right there. If you want to know more geological stuff, I can share some information, but I'm probably not the best person to talk about it. So at the moment, with the drilling that's been done, we've basically, in some areas, it's been confirmed as deep as 120 meters. In some areas, it's between 60 to 120 meters deep. And then some of the drill holes never came out of the deposit, i.e. they're open-ended. It's open at depth is what we call it in mining, which means there's potential for more stuff deeper down, hopefully better quality stuff. But in the, you know, it's going to be a while before we get there because there's quite a lot to get through. It's about 1,000 feet long. So there's a big area, but it's very much, there's one central zone of the deposit where the jade is very concentrated in terms of where the width of the ore body really gets wide. And so you could say 80% of the deposit is in this one kind of pod in the middle, which is great. I mean, from a mining point of view, that's extremely convenient. And this is just an example. This is a cross section here, and this just shows. So the deposit, the strike, is like coming down towards you guys and away from you, or you can see it there on the cross section on that bottom right. So that's a cross section going through monolith number 2, which is right there. And here you can see the drill holes. So in that particular area, wherever there's green, that means jadeite's been hit. But you can actually see it does end. It doesn't go on in that zone. It doesn't go on forever. It actually comes out the other end. But it's, you know, from a mining point of view, a lump is the best shape. A lump near the surface is always the best shape. So that's really, really good. No. Yeah, we just let it go. It's, I mean, it could be a factor of just the stuff that I've seen has been on the surface for a long time, but it's very kind of like friable almost. It's sort of broken up. It doesn't seem like a competent rock. I mean, you can literally put an excavator tooth in it, and you can dig it almost like hard clay. Yeah. So, but again, I don't know if that's something, because I haven't had to remove any overburden on the pit walls. So I don't know whether that's just a factor that, it's been sitting there for a long time and it's been oxidized, or, and generally beaten down by the weather. In terms of would it be beautiful if it didn't break apart, it's black and blotchy. It would have been. It was. I mean, at one point it was all around the jade, right? But now, and yes, it is deeper down. That's the contact zone. Its contact zone is between the serpentinite and the jade. But a whole massive area of serpentinite has now been removed, so that the jade can be accessed. Okay, so in terms of what does our jade look like? Well, gray and green, those are the main colors. You do get some areas where it's lighter gray. You could argue maybe it's dark white. But on the whole, these are the colors that I've sort of identified. Forgive me for the probably amateur names, but we had to call them something. But our gray stuff is gray. I mean, it's fundamentally, it's gray. One of the most interesting materials that we have is this kind of conglomerate material where you can see that the jade has been broken up and then fused together. So white jade has been broken up and fused together with green jade, which is really, really cool. And if you come by our stand out here, you can see it in some of our bangles that we've got, where you've got like half a bangle of conglomerate material and then half a bangle of something else. Could be gray or green or something like that. So that's really fascinating. This one we call light moss. That's it. This picture's not showing up very well, but that's where we kind of get that more bright apple green type colors coming through the jade. And then another one, and then we get essentially the equivalent of that mossy one, but we get a dark green one of those. And then we got this one we call dark formation, where you get these. It almost looks like waves of dark green. And if you get a piece like that, where you get like this kind of really sharp line, and it's I don't actually have a piece here, but it kind of, if you polish it up, it looks really, really cool. It's kind of got this shimmery look to it in the green, which is fun.
We have someone with a question.
Oh yeah. Well, Justin has carved some, but I'm not sure if Justin's in the room. No. He's manning his booth. Yeah, so he's got comments on it. In terms of, he said it's different than a bit different than carving Burmese jade, but it's certainly possible to carve because we've carved all kinds of things out of it. But what we have found with the people who do carve in China is some of them don't say anything. They do it. Some of the carvers say, "Great, just do it. Pay me, thank you." Some of them say, "Oh, this is different than what we're used to, but we've practiced and now we can do it." So I think it's not overly difficult, but it's just making some slight alterations to the way that you do it. Essentially, it's a different jade. Okay. All right. Again, an area where I'd even struggle to tell you what those chemicals are or minerals are on the side. But anyway, that's the normal range for Burmese, and that's sort of where we sit in terms of Kazakh jade. All right. So it in some ways, I know Burmese is more translucent and finer crystal structure and stuff like that, but it's similar. It's got a lot of similar colors that you might see in Burmese, but just like a less translucent. But the kind of greens we get and stuff like that is interesting. And then from a mineralogy point of view, also similar. So there was this thing when Kevin, who's the owner of the mine, when he first heard about this mine, which was in 2008, he wasn't sure whether it was jadeite or not. He didn't know. And it was difficult in those days until there was the feng shui standard, which was like officially published by the Hong Kong Association of Gemology. It was hard. If you weren't Burmese and it wasn't, coming from the Kachin state in Burma, it was tricky, right? And so a bunch of studies were done, some PhD studies and various things, and some have been done since this time. But you'll see these all predate 2016, and this was Kevin basically trying to work out is, do I spend more money on this thing? Is it really jadeite? Everything was telling him, yeah, it's the same stuff. But there wasn't that kind of official standard seal of approval confirmation that was required in order to do that. And then the feng shui standard came out, and then easy. That's fine. It was plain sailing from there. Here's a few more close-up pictures of the deposit. You can see this is part of the monolith. That's already had a layer of weathered stuff removed. And what you can see is, there's a lot of green in this material. I mean, these are big veins of green material, which we're looking forward to mining. And you can see some of it coming out like that. And there will be gray as well. I mean, I personally like it to be really green or really gray. That's my preference. I quite like the clean grays when they come out. I think they're actually really attractive. And then a few more. That's me sitting on a piece of rock. So that piece of rock I'm sitting on was weighed 26,000 pounds. And that I'll show you in a bit. We ended up donating that to the Guangdong Jade Exchange, essentially to the Chinese government, as a big feature outside their main building. More rough. It's just giving you guys a view, and then obviously we get the nicer stuff, we get the higher quality green stuff, and occasionally we get this, which is very, very exciting when we do. Just like any jade mine, if you get the transparent green glassy stuff, it's obviously a bit of a bonus. But it is in there. And there are reports from actually the Soviet times of there being significant amounts of imperial jade, or I don't know whether you call it imperial, the definition, but essentially green transparent jade. And a lot of that was sent to Moscow during the Soviet Union times. So how did the mine develop? I'll just take you through the chronology. Essentially, like I said, the Soviets, they found it. They did some drilling. They did some overburden work. They were pretty careless. They used some explosives near the surface, which is obviously not something you want to do when you've got a jade mine. Luckily, that damage, because the thing's large, it was contained, but you could say it damaged meters of material, outside meters of material. And that happened after the Soviet Union. It was taken over by some Russian owners, and they just wanted to hunt for the imperial, which is kind of a crime when you've got a huge body of jade and you're like, I'm going to throw everything away because I'm just looking for this tiny little nugget in there. And also, it's not really feasible because it's really hard if somebody gives you, 100 cubic meters of jade and says in there there's a pea-sized piece that's going to make you rich. Like, how do you even find it? How do you even set about doing that without turning to dust? So that was kind of silly, and that never went anywhere. And then, like I said, Kevin came along in 2008. He started testing it. He tried to work out whether it was really jadeite. And it wasn't until 2016 that he kind of got his level of confidence up, because he had to buy the mine. It wasn't like he'd just say, oh, yes, congratulations, it's jadeite. It's not going to cost me any money. There was a big bill to pay if he decided to take it over. So that came out. That was the eureka moment. They ended up buying the mine in 2017. They did more test work on it, more exploration. Then COVID hit. China was totally closed for about 3 years. And also you couldn't travel. Even you couldn't travel to Kazakhstan. So it was just dead time. And that obviously hurt the operation. So any business and you can't do anything is pretty bad. And that's actually when I came along in 2022 and Kevin asked me for help. And I said, that's fine, I will help. But you need to give me a big supply of jade too, because I want to be part of it. after I'd read the geological maps. And so we started to get the mining going. Oh, sorry. Oh, it's fine. We started to get the mining going, and in 2025, we started exporting to China. And then the next challenge is what do we do with this jade that we brought into China? Because we're like the new guys, and obviously not Chinese. So that was tricky. You know, it's a hard market to break. It's a hard market to get yourself established in because it's been around for literally thousands of years, and you're the new guys. In terms of the mining, so the next steps, what we're going to do is we're going to bring in these track diamond wire saws. This will allow us to be a lot more delicate. Now that we're getting out of the weathered zone, obviously we don't want to use breakers in good jade. That would be an absolutely criminal thing to do. So we're going to start cutting with diamond wire saws. You've got these ones that run on tracks now, which is a new development, instead of on rails. It makes it a lot easier, particularly when you've got limited space to move around. We know where there's higher grade zones that we'll be moving into, and fundamentally we will stop exporting rough. It'll be rough in terms of not finished product, but we'll stop, just sort of jagged shapes and this and that. It's quite risky with jade. If you send a boulder, halfway, across China is like halfway across the world. It's a hell of a long way to the other side of China, and then you get to the other end and you cut it in half, and it's full of cracks. It's a problem, right? So you notice here, like everything we brought here, we just brought cubes because we know, if there's a cube, and if there is a crack in the cube, at least the person buying the cube knows that they got a crack in the cube, and they know exactly what they're dealing with. All right, we've kind of covered this already. It's ethical mining. There's a very small team. We don't use any chemicals. We use a few items of equipment. We have a camp where everybody lives. You could say it's different to how jade is or can be certainly mined in other areas of the world. And this is something that we certainly want to build on because it is something that's becoming more and more important for consumers. Believe it or not, and even in China, the young are starting to be concerned about these things. China is changing, like rapidly changing. It's not really the China of old, where we assume they're prepared to break every rule and to do it. I'm not saying it's got a long way to go, but you'd be really surprised, particularly in areas like Guangzhou and stuff like that. It's come a hell of a long way, particularly since COVID. So, entering into China with a new jade. This could apply to anybody. This just applies to us because we're bringing jadeite, a new jade from Kazakhstan. But what if you bring a new nephrite from the US and you're coming into the Chinese market and you want to sell it there? Because at the end of the day, that is the biggest market for any nephrite or jadeite product. And one thing I'll say, it's very complicated. We were lucky. I was lucky for one reason. I'd been bought out by a Chinese company when I sold my coal mines, and there was an American guy called Matthew Clearfield from Pennsylvania who'd organized that whole thing, and he'd been in China for 20 years. And when we started this project, I told him about the project. He invested, and so we had our own guy in China that I knew, a close friend of mine, invested in the company, and he took on trying to find the route through. Honestly, without that, I'd still be on base zero. Like I wouldn't have made any progress. It was lucky because his best friend is China's wife was best friends with the wife of the CEO of the Guangdong Jade Exchange. Like a 1 in a billion chance that we'd end up with the right people, with the right thing happening. But it happened. Sometimes you are lucky, and that's great. Being lucky is a good thing. But even with that, even with all that progress, they were suspicious, and they still are. They're suspicious of a new material because if you buy a piece of our jade, on the whole, unless it's cut up into cubes here, it's quite big. Might be half the size of a car. They're quite big pieces, and people are nervous to buy that if they don't know what you can make out of it, and they want to see it. So it's actually forced us to become a vertically integrated company where we have to start to produce products. And essentially, that's one thing that we've had to do. We initially assumed we'd be selling rough, but actually, we are now producers. So that's it. And also we have to produce different things. And it appears to me, from what I can see, just talking to people around here, when it comes to nephrite, there seems to be more out-of-the-box thinking in China, more contemporary sculpture and stuff like that. But I would say from jadeite, it seems to be less so. I don't know if that's something that I've just observed or the region of China that we're in, but it's all very standard. And you want to go outside of that, there's quite a lot of resistance to do that, or quite a lot of skepticism. If you do it, then the result comes out and everybody's like, oh, wow, how do you think of that? And we're like, well, we were thinking outside the box. But there's quite a lot of resistance to it. So that's also something. This is just, I have no idea how I'm doing for time. Jordan.
You're good. You have like 8 minutes.
Oh, okay, fine. All right. I'll crack on. Okay, so this is us. In China, they like you to put your thumbs up when you take a photo. So that's why we do that. But this is us. This is a new jade exchange. This is the new tower. Spent several $100 million on it. And this is a 26,000-pound lump of jade put in front of it. They put the Jade Exchange, which is essentially the government, they wanted to carve a thing on it talking about friendship between Kazakhstan and China. I didn't realize they were going to write it in Russian, in yellow below, which you can't see. The morning of the event, to my horror, they'd written nephrite. Of course, nephrite's a pretty material, but it was the wrong name on there. I decided not to say anything. It was too late. So it still says nephrite. But the thing is, if you actually Google translate or whatever it is, jade in Russian, you will 99.9% of the time, it will say nephrite as opposed to jadeite. I read Russian. I speak it fluently, but I read it badly. But the Guangdong Jade Exchange have been fantastic. They've been a huge support for us. And that has allowed us to get established. That's me with the boss lady of jade. And we've now in China, we've corporately set ourselves up. We've got a team. We've got manufacturing partners. We've created a brand. We've created products. We've started sales. We've got distribution. So we have made a lot of progress. And boss lady, who's wearing an extremely expensive jade pendant, which I think cost about $4 million. But that's fine. If you sell $700,000 a day, you can afford that. That's her checking out some of our urns, which is something that we make. Okay, so I'll just show you some of our products. I shouldn't actually call that our product because Justin carved that. So that's actually Justin's product. And it is on his stand outside. So anybody's welcome to go and get it. But it's absolutely beautiful. But in the little bit of time I've got left, to just show you, these are some of the pendants that are created from our material. And some of the bangles. And our material, particularly with a kind of an intricate carved bangle, it sort of, I would say, brings out the best in our jade, but obviously it's more work to do that. We do a bunch of different carvings. We've had some of those on our stand. I think they might have all gone now. There might be one or two left. The beauty products, these are actually starting to go into the UK now. The gua shas and the rollers and all those things. Okay, so those are the more traditional things. But if you do have a large jade deposit, we wanted to start thinking, what could you do, right? How far could you take this? So one of the things we started to look, and I'm not saying I've caught every one, but I wanted to look at what are some of the biggest things that have been made out of nephrite and made out of jadeite. The one at the top, I don't think that's nephrite. One of you in this room will know whether that is or not. But I have put a little star next to saying nephrite because I think it might be some other kind of rock. 386 tons does seem quite excessive. But there you go. But on the jadeite front, the spirit of jadeite at 2.95 tons is the biggest. Somebody they haven't finished putting in the order, but somebody has ordered a jade bathtub. And so we haven't received the down payment yet, but they can afford it, put it that way. So can it be done? Well, we'll find out. Well, if they pay for it, we'll have to do it, right? So a one-piece jade bathtub will be fascinating. An area, despite the fact they're claiming we want to become a lifestyle brand, we've gone more death style. So So the Han Dynasty being buried in a jade suit was something that was considered would protect the flesh. It would give a path to the other side, essentially to the afterlife, a smooth path to the afterlife, protect the spirit. And in Taiwan, they still have a tradition of being buried in jade urns. I mean, they're nephrite urns because Taiwan had its own nephrite. But there are these key things. The bridge between worlds, it helps you travel to the next life. The eternal garden, jade is eternal. Just like Jordan was saying, jade will be around forever, unlike something like wood. And a final act of devotion. So it's all to do with Confucius and virtue and by the children, let's say, burying their parents and putting them in urn, it's sort of a statement to say the parents were virtuous and etc. So all good stuff. And we have started to create jade urns. So these are what our jade urns look like. And yeah, I mean, believe it or not, I was actually thinking about bringing this one here, taking the lid off and just telling everybody it was a vase. I think it could have been quite popular. Just wasn't enough space in my suitcase. Yeah, there we go. It's a cookie jar. That is a super high-end cookie jar right there. But yes, this is actually our one of the main products that we produce now. We've made jade tables. We have been working with this company called Best Time that make illuminated panels. We cut the jade 2 millimeter thick into very thin sheets and then put it onto an aluminium like honeycomb thing and shine LEDs through it. And it glows and it's really, really cool. And so we've done test stuff and test tables, but it's not something we've gone into like production of, but we're expecting that that's probably going to be quite a popular thing when it comes out. We've done jade tiles. These are mosaics. We just sent a bunch of these actually into Japan recently. And it's essentially jade architecture. Sometimes this works. There we go. Jade ashtrays. Nobody really smokes anymore in the US. But in China, everybody smokes. So certainly popular in China. Jade mobile phone cases. So there's a little disc of jade in each one. We actually have these on our stands right now. The only problem is you have to have like an iPhone 16 Pro Max or 17 Pro Max. I've still got an iPhone 12, so I can't even afford to basically put my own case on. But there we go. And then outside, if you come and see us, you'll see some jade cubes. Seen those. We've got jade beads, although they're just separate beads. They're not actually turned into bangles. And bangles. And there we go, guys. That's a bit of information about Kazakh jade.
If you got a chance to wander around the festival a little bit, you may have noticed some Guatemalan jade here and there, much more than you would normally see in a traditional jewelry store. It may have even been a little surprising to see so much and so many different colors. Maybe you hadn't heard of Guatemalan jade before today, and maybe you thought it all came from Burma, or as of a couple hours ago, Kazakhstan. Some vendors label their jade by origin and are quick to tell you where their jade was mined. The transparency is important to customers and to the artists themselves. The connection to jade is more than just visual. It's tactile and it's cultural. And there's a deeper connection, one that maybe can't be explained with words. Because of this, some customers want to collect jade from all the origins, or some may prefer a particular one. While I am confident that the jade sellers at this festival and in this room are honest, there are sellers out there who may try to take advantage of their customers. As finer and finer Guatemalan jade continues to hit the international market, the importance of disclosure becomes more critical. Our next speaker, Dr. Aaron Palke from the Gemological Institute of America, is an expert on this particular topic and has very good news for sellers who are committed to transparency and honesty. Dr. Palke received his PhD in geology from Stanford University and later began his gemological career as a postdoctoral research associate at GIA, where he is now the senior manager of colored stone research. In this role, Dr. Palke leads GIA's research efforts in geographic origin determination for rubies, sapphires, emeralds, and other colored stones. Speaking today on the topic of origin determination in jadeite jade, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Aaron Palke.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Jordan. And thank you everyone for attending the talk. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Aaron Palke, as Jordan mentioned. I'm the manager of colorstone research at GIS. So everything that comes through the lab that's not a diamond or a pearl, I'm kind of behind the scenes doing the research to make sure we're doing our origin reports and our identification reports as accurately and as consistently as possible. And one of the reasons I really am happy to be at this conference is that most of what we do with colored stones at GIA is rubies, sapphires, emeralds, spinels, things that are really big in the colored stone market in the Western world. And while we have done a lot of jade historically, I've never really got to touch a lot of the research with jade because we kind of knew what we needed to know. We knew how to tell if a jade was treated, if it had treated color, or if it was impregnated, and this, so on and so forth. And so I never got to delve too much into jade research until this problem of origin determination started rearing its ugly head with jade, and specifically jadeite jade. And so I'm really excited that this symposium is going on because I want to see more of this kind of activity and more interest in jade going on in the Western world, which is where most of what GI's business is located, because I really love jade and I'd love to be able to do some more work with jade. And so today we're talking about origin. I'll start out from the beginning saying that this is a talk about what people might call fei choi jade. We're not going to be talking about nephrite jade. I haven't done a lot of work with nephrite jade. I can field some questions at the end if you have questions, but for the most part, we're talking about fei choi jade. And I should also say from the outset, this is going to be slightly more technical, or maybe quite a bit more technical than some of the other talks. And so if I go over things too quickly or that anything's not clear, just let me know. I know everyone had a big lunch just now. My wife ate half a pizza, and so Jordan's going to make sure she doesn't fall asleep. But if anybody has any questions, you can interrupt me, stop me as we're going along. I'm going to pay for that joke later, I think. So fei choi jade. We're talking about jadeite jade. That's kind of the more common way to describe it, jadeite jade. But it actually encompasses more than jadeite jade. So there are this group of minerals called pyroxenes. And jadeite is part of the pyroxene mineral group, as well as omphacite and cosmochlor. Those are the main ones we're worried about with jade when it comes to pyroxenes or fei choi jade. And these minerals are all distinct. They're distinct minerals, but they have the same basic crystal structure. So if you look at them on an atomic level, they're arranged in pretty much the same way. If you know the word topology, they have the same topology. So you have, like in jadeite, sodium, aluminum, and silicon. If you forgot your periodic tables, the Na is sodium, Al is aluminum, Si is silicon, and O is oxygen, of course. And so we have that silicon atom in a specific site in jadeite. And in omphacite and cosmochlor, you have that same silicon atom in the same site in that general crystallographic structure. So these are all just basically structurally related minerals. But the important thing is the chemistry differs. So we go from jadeite, which is one of the more simple versions. And then if you replace some of the sodium and the aluminum with calcium, magnesium, and iron, you get something that looks like an omphacite, which again, same structure, but different chemistry. And then you have cosmochlor, of course, where you put a bunch of chromium in there instead of aluminum. And so nephrite jade is really kind of the original jade in terms of like at least the Chinese lore of jade. It was the kind of first historically important source of jade that the Chinese were using. But once they discovered high quality jadeite or fei choi jade in Burma, in northern Burma, it became a very important gemstone for China and a lot of the rest of the world. And the important thing is that for most of history, Burma was really the kind of top source, the only really important commercial source of gem grade fei choi jade. There are other sources like Guatemala, Russia, Japan, Italy, Kazakhstan, but none of them really rivaled Burma in terms of the commercial output and as well as the quality. And so to kind of drive that point home, we're going to be talking about mostly Burma versus Guatemala. I'll touch on some of the other sources later in the talk, but for now we're talking about these two sources because they are currently the two most important commercial sources for gem grade fei choi jade. So Guatemala, in contrast, it's been known for a long time. The ancient cultures in the area extracted jade and had their distribution networks and moved it all around Middle America and beyond. But for the most part, the quality of this material was nothing like the top quality you got in Burma. So this is like a photo of some what I'm calling typical Guatemalan jade. It's nice. It was good carving material. You could make tools and jewelry out of it. But it never rivaled that top like imperial quality jade coming out of Burma. It was kind of rediscovered by Mary Lou Rittinger in the 1970s and kind of brought back to the world. But even then, compared to, again, the top quality Burmese stuff, it was really nothing like the top quality Burmese stuff. Now, things started changing maybe 6 or 7 years ago, at least to my knowledge. I had a colleague in Hong Kong, and this was like right at the COVID lockdown, so we were meeting quite a lot on the phone just to keep in touch and see what was going on and like help with her research and coordinate things in the lab. And she mentioned in early 2000, when we were all stuck at home, she mentioned that the Chinese were starting to become worried about Guatemalan jade. And she mentioned specifically top quality imperial green jade coming from Guatemala, entering the Chinese markets and being passed off as Burmese. And at the beginning, when this stuff was starting to come out, that would have been relatively easy to do because nobody had ever seen stuff like this coming out of Guatemala. I mean, Mary can correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, this is a relatively recent find and only entered the market really kind of 6 or 7 years ago. And of course, there's no problem with this Guatemalan material coming out, but it was known and the Chinese were becoming worried about it being passed off as Burmese. And so at GI, we recognize a big research opportunity to come in and it provides some transparency to the market so that people could buy and sell their material with known provenance, knowing where the material came from and how it got to the market. Now, this is a somewhat interactive slide here. I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between things. I'm going to talk about some other color stones as well, just because I'm a color stone researcher and I can't help myself with that. And it also provides some context for what we'll be talking about later. But here's a question for y'all. So these two jades, let's say there's the same carat weight, more or less the same quality factors in terms of transparency. Does anybody have a preference for which one you prefer? On the right? Some for the left, some for the right. What if I gave you some more information and told you the one on the left was Burmese and the one on the right was Guatemalan? Would anybody change their opinions on this? No? I suppose it would depend on what you were trying to do. If you were selling the piece, you might want the Burmese stone instead, right? If it's for your own personal collection, I kind of agree. I'd want the Guatemalan piece. But what if you were trying to sell this stone? You would want the one on the left, right? And why is that? Does anybody have an opinion on why that's value, but rarity. Okay, that's a good point there. Rarity, provenance. But why is the value so tied to the origin? And should it be? So there's a lot of reasons why one might want one of these stones over the other. I agree. For my own personal collection, I'd want the Guatemalan stone. But if I was selling and buying stones, I'd want that Burmese piece because I know I could get more value on the market. Even if I don't personally necessarily agree that the Burmese stone should cost more, I know that the market kind of dictates that. And so before we get to kind of the nitty-gritty of the jade research we've been doing and how we actually do origin determination on jade, I want to take a step back and just kind of talk about origin from a historical point of view, and so we can kind of understand why we're in the situation with origin that we are, why different values are ascribed to stones from different locales. And kind of in our digging through the literature, this was an important article that came out in Gems and Gemology that kind of frames the discussion very well, I think. This is written by Dr. Edward Gublin, one of the luminaries in gemology, and he wrote this article about the differences between Burmese and Siamese rubies. And so he went through this, in this article, he went through and he kind of described all of the different properties you would look at to know if the ruby you had was from Burma or from Siam or Thailand, Cambodia. And this was important back in 1940 because there were kind of really only two major sources of rubies back in the day when he wrote this article. And that was Burma and Siam. And so he had photomicrographs of the inclusions you would look at to distinguish the two stones. He talked about the differences in colors between these stones from these two deposits. But importantly, in one passage, he wrote that there's a considerable difference in price between the two, caused by the less pleasing color of the ruby from Siam, which the latter usually is brownish orange and of lower intensity. So he was kind of branding these two stones, and he was using the argument that the reason they should be branded differently is that there were differences in quality. So the stones from Burma had a higher quality, higher color, better appearance than those from Siam. And he was saying this is the reason why there's a difference in the price between these two. Now, we can go through tons of the literature out there. There's a special issue of Gems and Gemology in winter 2019. If you care about things other than jade, which I think probably some of you guys do, I'd encourage you to look at this. It's a really good compendium of articles about ruby, sapphire, emerald, tourmaline, and alexandrite origin determination. And we kind of go through all of the information we have. We go through all the criteria we use in the lab to be able to distinguish stones from different origins for these categories. Now, so there's from 1940 to 2019, a whole bunch of explosion in the literature on origin in different stones. But I'm going to take a step even further back. This is a book from 1572, and this was dug up by a postdoctoral researcher we had for a while at GI. Her name is Dr. Sona Tajirian, and she was a historian. She was an Armenian historian, actually. And she specialized in, actually her specialty was deciphering this very ancient dialect of Armenian that was used by Armenian gem traders back in the day. This one's actually not in Armenian. This is in Spanish, but this is a book written by the court jeweler of Philip II. And in 1572, he states that Esmeralda Oriental would be worth about twice as much as Esmeralda Meridional. So again, this is like right after, or it's very close in time to when the Spanish had just conquered a lot of land in South America and in Mexico. And they came across these emerald deposits in what's now Colombia. And they brought these emeralds back to the old world. And it's safe to say no one in the old world had seen emeralds anything like the quality that they brought back from Colombia. The Colombian emeralds that were brought back to Europe and then spread throughout Asia were of higher quality, larger sizes, greater transparency, greater color than anything the old world would have seen before. However, these Esmeralda Orientals, or the Eastern emeralds, also called Esmeralda Vieja here in this text, were valued at twice as much as the Meridional or the new emeralds coming from Colombia. And this is further supported by another text. This was actually the text in that dialect of Armenian that our postdoc, Dr. Tajirian, had deciphered. He further supports this, and this is actually later on. So this was from the 1730s to 1740s. So almost 200 years later, there was still this prejudice against Colombian emeralds compared to the old world emeralds, which might have been Egyptian or some other source of emeralds. But he was saying that a carat of old mine or Egyptian emerald was worth 2,000 to 5,000 dians for the good quality, down to 500 dians for bad quality, whereas the new mine or Colombian emeralds would have only been worth about 1,000 to 5,000 dians per carat for good quality, down to about 100 dians per carat for bad quality. So this prejudice against the stunning Colombian emeralds that nobody had ever seen anything like those before, compared to the old world emeralds, was still persisting for 200 years past the day when they were discovered. And in the next slide, I'm gonna show why this is so perplexing to me, because if you've ever seen an Egyptian emerald, they're really nothing like a Colombian emerald. So we have a nice, stunning Colombian emerald here compared to some of the best Egyptian emerald I've ever seen personally, which is shown there on the right. So in terms of clarity, color, size, everything, these Colombian emeralds were out of the world better than the old world Egyptian emeralds. So it can be very difficult to understand value and provenance. The important thing is, which I think everybody understands, value, origin matters no matter what the reason origin matters for. And so in the last year, we're able to offer several new origin services. The last year's actually been pretty exciting for my research group, because we've had all these 4 new origin services launched in the last year. So Fei Choi Jade, which is the topic of discussion today, but also opal, demantoid, and peridot as well, peridot garnets. And it was exciting for me because like a lot of this research had been going on for like 10 years, and then they finally like pulled the trigger and allowed us to start offering these services to the trade, including Fei Choi Jade. So we do currently offer Fei Choi origin, but there's a few criteria we have to go over first. So the first thing is that it has to be Fei Choi jade. So again, it has to be a jade made dominantly of pyroxene minerals, jadeite, omphacite, and cosmochlor. And as someone mentioned earlier, X-ray diffraction, and the use of X-ray diffraction to determine the mineralogy of a piece of jade. And while X-ray diffraction is really useful for that regard, it is at least a semi-destructive technique. You have to scrape off a little bit of material from the piece you're looking at or crush it. And so it's not really the ideal way to go about this. The way we would do it in the lab is with Raman spectroscopy. And so this is a photo of a Raman spectrometer here with the cover opened up and the guts of the instrument inside. Spectroscopy is basically, we're going to talk a lot about spectroscopy. So right off the bat, spectroscopy is basically the science or the study of how light interacts with matter. So in this case, the light we use is a green laser at 514 nanometers. It goes through the guts of this instrument, bounces off a bunch of lenses and mirrors, through a bunch of filters, and makes its way out through this microscope lens and hits your sample. And what happens then is that this light, this monochromatic light at 514 nanometers actually interacts with the crystalline structure of the material you're looking at. And it causes vibrations to be distributed throughout the sample. And based on the specific crystallographic atomic arrangement of your atoms in the structure, it can only vibrate at certain specific wavelengths. And so basically you measure the vibrational modes coming off of your sample, so you get backscattered reflections off the sample that reflect the vibrational modes of the material, and you get a nice fingerprint of the crystalline structure that you're looking at. So here's an example. These are two Raman spectra of jadeite and omphacite, and so they're going to have very distinct peaks in specific places. So we'll look at this pattern, and if we have peaks in these exact locations here, we know we're looking at a jadeite jade. And if you have peaks that look like this with more broad humps in kind of similar positions as those you see in the jadeite, but broader and slightly shifted in position, you'll know you're looking at an omphacite instead. So this is a really nice technique. It's non-destructive. You can identify things like nephrite, which is an amphibole type jade. So an amphibole will have a very distinct Raman pattern compared to the jadeite and the omphacite, and we can automatically know what kind of jade we look at. So every stone that comes through the lab, any jade, gets 3 Raman spectra collected, at least 3 Raman spectra collected, and we are able to determine if it's a jadeite, omphacite, or a nephrite jade based on that. We can go a little further. This is a little more high-tech research that we've been doing lately, where we can do Raman mapping. So we can take a stone like this, set in this ring, we can pull out a small little rectangular area on that ring and map every single point on that to determine if it's a jadeite or an omphacite jade. So in this case, the jadeite spots are in the bright red there, and the omphacite is being shown in the green. So this is actually a very fine mixture of both jadeite and omphacite. So does anybody do jade reports with GI often? If you've seen jade reports from GI, you'll notice sometimes, like oftentimes you'll get a jadeite jade. You might sometimes get an omphacite jade, which is a little more common in Guatemala than in Burma. But you might also sometimes get a jadeite and omphacite jade report, in which case the Raman would have shown both omphacite and jadeite in 3 or more of those spectra that we collected on the sample. Now, this is a really nice technique because we get a nice averaging of everything in the stone, but it takes quite a bit longer. So this analysis would take probably a couple hours to collect, whereas taking 3 Raman spectra would take about 5 minutes. It's mostly just the surface, yeah. So it's interacting with a very shallow amount of the material, so maybe, a few hundred microns, but probably not penetrating much deeper than that. All right, so the next criteria we have to look at to see if our jade is eligible for origin determination is treatment. So say you submitted this stone, and it came out to be a Fei Choi jade, probably a jadeite or an omphacite jade. This one's most likely a jadeite jade. But the problem is there are a lot of treatments done on Fei Choi jade, and GI only currently offers origin determination for untreated or type A jade. So I'll go over quickly our type classification for jade, where we discuss the different types of treatments that can go on in a jade. So for Fei Choi jade, a type A jade is a untreated stone. So it was removed from the ground, polished, and that's basically all that was ever done to that stone. It had that nice color, the transparency, everything directly out of the ground. It may have some slight wax residue on the surface, which sometimes happens with a lot of jade. But beyond that, there would have been nothing else happening to the stone. Now, type B and type C are not eligible for origin determination. So a type B stone would have been bleached in acid. So a lot of jade comes out of the ground with impurities, either impurities that cause poor coloration or kind of structural instability in the stone. And so you can take a stone like that, where it has other materials other than jadeite or omphacite in the structure. You can bleach it in acid to remove a lot of that material. And then you're left with a more pure material, but there's a lot of kind of holes and fractures in the stone because you've leached out some of that structure. And so in order to maintain structural integrity, you'll then need to polymer impregnate the stone with resins or other kind of epoxies to get that structural integrity back. The more kind of extreme type of treatment would be a type C jade, where you do the same thing. You bleach the stone in acid, you dye it to give it a better color, an artificial color, and then polymer impregnate it to seal it in. So if you had a stone that looked like this, if you were able to look in the microscope and look at the color distribution of your jade, if you see these concentrations of color along the fractures going all through the stone, you would know this is a dyed jade. Natural jade doesn't usually have such heavy concentrations of color directly along fractures. And so if we see these dye concentrations in fractures, we know we have a type C jade, and it would not be eligible for origin determination. Another way we can look at this is with visible near-infrared spectroscopy. So we'll talk a little bit more about what's actually happening with visible spectroscopy later, but suffice it to say, it's a very good way of looking at the causes of color in different gemstones. So in jade, we would look for these chromium peaks. There's specific peaks in the visible range where we expect to see chromium peaks, and one's occurring at about 450 nanometers, another at about 650 nanometers. So if we see a spectrum like this, we know it's a natural colored green jade. We contrast that with this. This is a very typical visible spectrum of a dyed jade. So we have this kind of classical double hump that we call it in the lab, which looks entirely different from the pattern we get from a chromium-colored, natural-colored jade. All right, so we're going to skip to other stones beyond jade for a few minutes just to give up some background on origin determination. So when we started this jade project, we had never really thought about jade origin before. So we had to kind of take a step back and think about what we wanted to do, how we wanted to analyze the stones to determine where they were from, to be able to distinguish protocols for determining origin for jade from Guatemala and Burma. And for basically any colored stone you look at, if you want to do an origin determination study, there's kind of four things you would look at, four qualities or four properties of a stone you would look at to be able to determine origin. The first would be appearance. So as an example here, this is a Kashmir sapphire on the left compared to a Sri Lankan sapphire. Now, appearance on its own usually doesn't tell you an origin. Usually you can't definitively call an origin on a stone based on only its appearance. But you can get a good indication in many cases of origin. So on the left is this Kashmir sapphire, and it has that classic sleepy appearance that you expect from a high-quality Kashmir sapphire, which is not typically something you would see in a Sri Lankan sapphire, which would have more of a completely transparent, bright color compared to that of the sleepy color of the Kashmir sapphire. Another kind of more distinctive example of that is opal. So opal actually is a little more distinctive or definitive when you look at only the appearance. So in many cases, opal is one of the origin services we launched last year or earlier this year. And in many cases, you really can tell an Australian opal, for instance, from an Ethiopian opal. They have a very distinctive appearance. You get more of this classic patchy pattern of play of color in an Australian opal compared to these kind of cellular or digit patterns you see more often in an Ethiopian opal. Now, inclusions are actually one of the most important things we look at for origin determination for most gemstones. A classic example is a Burmese ruby. So this is what Dr. Gublin would have wrote about in that article I mentioned. One of the things he pointed out was that you can really tell the difference between a Burmese ruby and a Thai ruby very easily based only on the inclusion. So a Burmese ruby would have these nice needles of rutile silk going throughout the stone, oftentimes with this nice iridescent, bright, reflective appearance to them, especially if you use a fiber optic light to come in and get nice flashes of iridescent light off of those silk needles. And you would never see something like that in a Thai ruby. So Thai rubies would never have this rutile silk that you see in a lot of other rubies, but they would have these little melt decrepitation inclusions. So these are little blebs of magma that were trapped in these Thai rubies because they grew in a magmatic environment, in an igneous environment, where there was a lot of magma around, and those little blebs of magma sometimes got trapped within the ruby as it was growing, formed these nice little negative crystals, and then as they were being transported volcanically to the surface, those inclusions would have exploded out into the corundum and partially healed themselves along the geometric pattern of the corundum itself. Now you can look at spectroscopy as well. So this is an example of the peridot origin service we recently launched as well. And in many cases, you can do this spectroscopy technique called FTIR spectroscopy and get a very good indication of the origin of a stone based only on the pattern that we see in these spectra. So different peridot from different origins like Egypt, Pakistan, Tanzania, Norway, Kenya, and Burma oftentimes have very distinct patterns in the infrared spectroscopy we do on them. And you can often tell definitively where a stone may have come from, especially like stones from Egypt have a very distinctive pattern that is not matched anywhere else in the world. Now, as a last measure, we would come to trace element chemistry. And I say as a last measure because this is one of the most difficult things we do in the laboratory. It's one of the most time-consuming things we do. It takes a lot of time to get a trace element measurement on a stone, but it also is one of the most powerful things we can do in the lab. And it often is like our last line of defense in the origin realm. So this is an example of alexandrite origin determination. So alexandrite's the color change version of chrysoberyl. So stones that can go from a blue or a green in daylight to a purple or red in incandescent light. But they come from many origins. So Russia is the classic example. There's also Brazil, Tanzania, India, and Sri Lanka. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about what trace elements are and how we measure them. But suffice it to say, this is a plot of the element tin compared to the element gallium in alexandrites from these different origins, and it nicely separates out stones from these different origins. Now, the problem is that origin can't always be determined, and I think this is an important point to make. People oftentimes become very kind of upset with GIA when we write inconclusive on our origin reports, but the problem is that sometimes origin simply cannot be determined because the properties of stones overlap too strongly from stones between different deposits. So we can go through our 4 criteria and look at cases where things just fall apart, where you can't tell the origin of a stone based on these criteria. So here's an example of a Madagascar and a Burmese sapphire with essentially the same color, the same appearance. Nothing about the appearance of these stones would be able to tell you where that stone came from. We have the same problem with inclusions. So oftentimes, inclusions between stones from different deposits strongly overlap. Inclusions actually can be one of the most important things we look at when we're determining origin, but in some cases, there's simply too much overlap between stones from different deposits. So this is a Sri Lankan sapphire, a photomicrograph of a Sri Lankan sapphire compared to that of a Madagascar sapphire. So if I looked in the microscope at these 2 stones, I wouldn't be able to separate them based on their inclusions. There's too much overlap. These kind of milky bands with hexagonal patterns to them is something we more often associate with Madagascar, but we can see similar things in Sri Lanka as well. And so we can't always separate stones based on their inclusions. Spectroscopy oftentimes doesn't help at all either. So this is an example of emeralds from Brazil, Ethiopia, Russia, Madagascar, and Zambia. They're visible to near-infrared versions of these spectra. And you can see various features: chromium bands, iron 3+ bands, iron 2+ bands, and there's basically no difference between the emeralds from these different deposits. So spectroscopy is not helping us here either. And even our tried and true trace element chemistry can't always help us either. So this is a trace element plot of gallium and iron in blue sapphires from Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Madagascar. And sometimes in the lab, we call these shotgun scatter plots because you look at the reference data from these deposits and you can see there's basically no way you could tell where a stone came from if it falls within this field where Burma, Sri Lanka, and Madagascar all overlap. So I'm going to get to kind of some of the details of the Fei Choi jade origin service that we have and how we got to where we are with it. So basically, to reiterate the problem, Burma had always been the major commercial source of Fei Choi jade out in the market. But along came Guatemala a few years ago. Guatemala was a historic source, but of a local, kind of more of a local importance than a global commercial importance. Until a few years ago, when high quality imperial green jade started coming out of Guatemala, and we realized we had to try to solve this problem. So how did we go about this? And this is actually an important slide because a lot of the other stones we do origin for, ruby, sapphire, emerald, there have been papers written about them several decades ago. So Edward Gubelin wrote the first paper on ruby origin determination in 1940. So there was this wealth of information for several decades for most stones on which we do origin. And a lot of our lab staff had experience looking at stones from Burma, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Madagascar. So they had this experience built up over decades for these other stones that we've been looking at. But now all of a sudden, within a matter of like a year or two, we had to solve this problem from ground zero. So we hadn't really looked too much at stones from Burma or Guatemala to be able to look at different quality factors we could use to determine their origin. So we had to hit the ground running. We collected 373 samples in our reference database, and that includes 172 from Burma, 115 from Guatemala, and 86 from the other sources. We got the stones from internal collections at GIA, so a lot of our staff had reputable collections from Burma or Guatemala. We got them from reputable dealers, including Mason K. We got them from museums as well, so the GIA Museum provided a lot of samples, as well as the American Museum of Natural History. And then we set about looking at the 4 different quality factors I talked about. So appearance, inclusions, spectroscopy, and trace element chemistry. So we kind of already mentioned this. Appearance is not going to be helpful here. 10 years ago, if you looked at this stone, you might be able to confidently say it was from Burma because we'd never seen anything like this from Guatemala before. So 10, 20, 30 years ago, appearance could actually tell you something about the origin. But this is not useful anymore because we know there's a lot of top quality imperial jade coming out of Guatemala. Inclusions do play a part in a way. It's not definitive, but it can be part of the overall decision-making process for origin determination for a jade stone. So in some cases, we get these inclusions like these snowball inclusions that are more typical of Guatemalan material than they are Burmese. The problem is that you might sometimes see similar inclusions in Burmese material, but it's more common in Guatemala. So if it's one of these cases where you're trying to decide one or the other, and the other evidence is not necessarily definitive, the observation of these snowball inclusions might kind of push you more in the direction of Guatemala than Burma. The problem also, though, is that you don't always see these kinds of inclusions, and in most cases, the kind of overall internal appearance of a stone from Guatemala and Burma tends to overlap pretty strongly. There doesn't really appear to be any distinctive quality factors or inclusion scenes in either Burmese or Guatemalan jade. You get kind of splotchy color distribution, you get these nice felted crystalline masses and everything, but overall the appearance internally of stones from Guatemala and Burma tends to be very similar. We can turn to spectroscopy, and actually at the very beginning of our process looking at this, we thought spectroscopy might be able to help us a little bit. So we look at the spectroscopy, we see our chromium bands in there at about, again, 450 and about 650 nanometers. We have some iron bands out here in the near infrared. And at the beginning, we saw these slightly different patterns between Guatemala and Burma. So we saw these bands at about 800 nanometers and 900 nanometers, which seemed to be more typically associated with Guatemala. And we saw a nice band at about 850 that seemed to be more typically associated with Burma. But the more we started looking and the more we compared our reference data sets, we started to realize that you could see basically both of these patterns in either Guatemala or Burma. So the spectroscopy is only giving you a very general view of kind of the trace element chemistry of stones from these different deposits. And so it's not really giving you a very nuanced information about the kind of very small scale differences between stones from these two deposits. So at the end of the day, we had to come back to trace element chemistry. And the reason we don't like to have to come back to trace element chemistry is because we have to use this instrument here. And this is a laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer. And Jordan's going to be handing out a quiz at the end of this, so you have to make sure you remember that. But basically, this is a laser ablation system. It's two different instruments. It's a laser ablation system and an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer. And so what we do is we take our jade, we put it in this laser ablation unit, and we focus a 213 nanometer laser on a kind of an obscure out-of-the-way place in this stone where you're never going to really see it. And it creates a small pit, about 55 microns wide, which is about the width of a human hair. And we actually remove a small amount of material from your jade and put it into the mass spectrometer. So it goes into a plasma. A plasma is like the surface of the sun. So when you have something on the surface of the sun at those temperatures, you strip atoms apart, you strip electrons from atoms, and you create this nice plasma. So you create a lot of these positively charged ions that then go through a mass spectrometer and filter out the different ions based on their mass. And so we can make a sweep through the entire periodic table, measuring almost every element that might be present in a piece of jade by putting it through this laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer. Can anybody repeat that? No? So I realize I might be getting a little ahead of myself with this. I haven't really fully explained what trace elements are. So what are trace elements? Trace elements are small amounts of chemical elements that are part of the mineral but are not a necessary part of the mineral species. So take jadeite, for example. We mentioned jadeite fundamentally is only sodium, aluminum, silicon, and oxygen. But we know in nature, one of my colleagues, John Koivula, has this quote. He says, nature cooks in a dirty kitchen, which means that even though you only need these 4 elements to make jadeite, nature is dirty and you're gonna have a lot of other impurity elements mixed in with your jadeite, which are actually very useful for us because they help us to fingerprint stones from different deposits and know where a stone might have come from. So as an example, let's pretend that this colorless jadeite here only consists of sodium, aluminum, silicon, and oxygen. If we take some chromium atoms and shove those into the structure, we'll get something like this. These nice green pieces of jadeite jade are colored green by the presence of chromium. Now let's take a little further step and look at exactly what that actually means. So if I took a visible spectrum of this colorless jadeite, I would get something like this, a flat line, because the sodium, aluminum, silicon, and oxygen don't absorb any visible light. So this spectrum, when we see a spectrum and absorption on the side here, basically if you see a high point in the line, that means a lot of that light, that wavelength is getting absorbed. And if you see a low point, that means very little of that light at that wavelength is getting absorbed. So let's see what that actually looks like here. This is that green jade where we added the chromium in there. And so we see superimposed on this is the wavelengths of visible light, the colors of the wavelengths of visible light. So from 380 nanometers, we have kind of a violet to blue going into green to yellow, orange, and then red at the longer wavelengths. So when we add chromium, we change that flat line and we create these 2 broad humps, again at about 450 nanometers and about 650 nanometers. Those are the chromium atoms absorbing specific wavelengths of light and not absorbing specific wavelengths of light. So again, the higher this goes, the more of that light is being absorbed. The lower it goes, the less that light is being absorbed. And so the chromium absorbs a lot of that blue and red light and lets most of that green light come back to us, to our eyes. So when light enters the stone, even if it doesn't penetrate very fully into the stone, it's entering enough for the chromium atoms to absorb the blue and the red light, and all of that green light gets to come back to the stone, reflected out of it, and come back to our eyes. So what are we going to be looking at with trace element chemistry? So again, this is a nice ternary diagram with 3 end members. So we have a sodium aluminum end member, that's jadeite. We have a sodium and iron end member, that's edrine. And we have what's called quad up here. This is where you add a bunch of calcium, magnesium, and iron to the stone. This is more like a diopside, which is not as important for fei choi jade as most of these other members. These are all of our Burmese and Guatemalan stones, our reference stones plotted on this plot. You see most of them are plotting in jadeite and omphacite. And there is actually a little bit of a distinction here. There is, most of the Burmese material is plotting in jadeite, the jadeite field. More of the Guatemalan material is plotting in the omphacite field, but there is a significant amount of overlap. So just knowing that something is omphacite doesn't definitively tell you that it's from Guatemala, and just knowing that something is jadeite doesn't definitively tell you that it's from Burma, because there's way too much overlap with stones crossing over that boundary. But regardless, the major components we're going to be looking at with fei choi jade are sodium, magnesium, aluminum, silicon, calcium, and iron. But again, nature cooks in a dirty kitchen, so we can incorporate numerous other trace elements that can be useful for origin determination. And the basic idea, or the basic hope, is that the geological conditions in Burma would have been slightly different as they were in Guatemala to allow a different chemical fingerprint to be imprinted on the jade from these 2 deposits. So with our fancy mass spectrometer, we can measure things like lithium, boron, scandium, titanium, vanadium, so on and so forth, all these trace elements, if you have questions, I can tell you what these specific elements are, but basically most of the periodic table can be shoved into the crystal structure of jadeite and ophiolite and give us the possibility for a fingerprint to be found to determine origin for these two stones. So again, we come to our mass spectrometer, we measure the whole periodic table, but then we have to figure out what to do with that. I told you we have like we have hundreds of different reference stones from these different deposits. And that's a whole lot of data to go through manually. So it's oftentimes difficult for a human being to be able to look at these data and kind of find trends or patterns in there. And so we are applying things like machine learning. So if you're familiar with artificial intelligence, surely, machine learning is kind of a subset of artificial intelligence that allows us to play around with big data sets and kind of find patterns that human beings wouldn't have been able to find ordinarily. So for jadeite specifically, for Fei Choi jade specifically, we're using 3 different models. I know everyone just had lunch, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on these 3 models, but we use a random forest model, support vector machine model, and an artificial neural network. Kind of at a basic level, what we're doing here, you'll have probably heard about decision trees, right? A decision tree is a pretty commonly understood technique where you say, for instance, if the iron is greater than 10,000, you go to this decision tree. If it's less than 10,000, you go to this decision tree. And then you have another split where you might look at manganese, and you might look at boron, and then lithium, and so on and so forth. And a human being can put something like this together on their own, but a random forest model will do thousands of decision trees using all the reference data we have to be able to classify things according to their origin or other classifications. So that's the first model we're looking at. The second model, which is slightly more opaque, and they get more and more opaque as we go from 1 to 2 to 3. A support vector model will kind of take data in a dimensional space. So this is a 2-dimensional space. You can see there is a separation between these 2 classifications, right? Group 1 and group 2, you can kind of draw this nonlinear boundary between them. A support vector machine will kind of remap all these reference data into a different dimensional space where you get a linear boundary between these 2 groups. And this allows us to have more of a simple separation between these 2 different classifications, these 2 different origins. And importantly, it can do this in more than 2 dimensions. So it can do this in multi-dimensional space and allow us to consider multiple different dimensions that a human being wouldn't be able to really suss out on their own looking at only 2-dimensional plots. And the third one is something that is not really easy to explain. And most people don't even really understand exactly what this does, the artificial neural network. But it kind of organizes the data classification scheme like the human brain might do. And it passes data through what we call artificial neurons that process data, pass it to the next layer, so on and so forth. And this is really the more opaque of the 3 models. But it does seem to work in many cases. The problem is when it disagrees with the other 2 models, we don't know exactly why it disagrees with the other 2 models. So we took all this data, put it through these models, and found out what were the most important variables to look at. And so we get these discriminants. The discriminants, it doesn't really matter exactly what they are. They're kind of complex combinations of different trace elements that the machine learning models were able to pull out of the data. And we get pretty good separation between Burmese Fei Choi jade and Guatemalan Fei Choi jade. There is some overlap here, and that's reflected in our error rate of about 2% error rate for stones that we run through these models and put into this system. And we also have kind of more approachable techniques as well for the gemologists. So the machine learning is really good because it does things automatically. It goes through a lot of data quickly, and it gives you a pretty good confident answer. And it can give you like a confident, an error rate, basically. It'll tell you that it's 95% confident in the origin determination, or it's 92% confident, or 75% confident. And you can use that to kind of weigh out your decision-making process for the origin for a Fei Choi jade. We also have some tools for the gemologists to be able to look at. So the gemologists are making the final decision on origin calls for Fei Choi jade. And they oftentimes like to be able to understand why they should make a decision one way or the other. So we also have tools that allow them to get to more fully visualize the data for Burmese and Guatemalan jade. So this is an example. This is a europium versus cerium plot. So these are 2 rare earth elements. You may have heard of europium and cerium because they're rare earth elements. which are big in the news these days. But it's very simple to look at this and know what you're looking at. The problem is there's a lot of overlap between Guatemala in blue and Burma in orange. So I had this one unknown stone shown in these red squares. I wouldn't be able to make a call based only on these data. So these two-dimensional plots are nice to visualize data, but the problem is you're only looking at two variables at once. And there's a whole vast trove of additional trace element data we could be considering, but we're only limiting ourselves to two trace elements. So we developed this technique in the lab at GIA we call it selective plotting, where we take a two-dimensional plot, but we also consider every other trace element out there. And we say, which of these reference data has an overall similar chemistry as our reference data? So we say, we plot only the europium and cerium, but we're also considering iron, manganese, lithium, boron, gadolinium, so on and so forth. So all of the trace elements we're looking at, we see which of these reference data have similar overall chemical profiles as our unknown stones. And then we slowly start to filter out data with dissimilar overall trace element chemistry. So we do this in steps. So we filter out maybe with a window of 100% around those stones, and we go narrower and narrower. As we filter out more and more data, we can see this specific stone seems to agree overall with Burma over Guatemala. So its trace element chemistry, even though we're only looking at europium and cerium, overall with iron, manganese, lithium, boron, titanium, and vanadium, and chromium, is more similar to these Burmese stones than to the Guatemalan stones. And so this would allow us to make an origin call for this stone and to be able to visualize why it's more similar to Burma rather than Guatemala. Now, to address kind of the elephant in the room, there are other origins that we haven't really talked about and we're not currently offering origin for. So currently, the origin services for Fei-Troy jade are limited to Burma and Guatemala. But we know there is some limited production from Japan, historically at least, from Russia. There's historic stuff from Italy, Kazakhstan, and we have to consider these things in some cases as well. So commercially, these are not as important. Kazakhstan may be an up-and-coming source, but in the fine gem and jewelry industry, it's not really made it there quite yet. But certain things like Japan actually are important because we have a lab in Tokyo where certain clients may have collections of Japanese jade from historical sources. They may want origin determination for these stones. So we are currently trying to build up our data sets for these other stones. The limited data we have so far suggests that there is probably some significant overlap between some of these other sources like Japan and all the other sources. So we're kind of simplifying our classification here. We're not comparing Japan against Burma and Guatemala and Russia and Kazakhstan. We're only considering Japan against every other source. So this is a plot of strontium versus gadolinium versus boron to zinc. And you can see there's quite a bit of overlap. Similarly with Russia, so this is a plot of Russia against all the other sources. This is a different plot, so sodium versus thorium and zinc versus zirconium. You can see again, there is a little bit of separation, but a lot of overlap between Russia and every other source out there. So we're currently trying to get more and more data on these stones, build up our collection, our reference databases, and get more data so that we can try to use more advanced and sophisticated machine learning tools or artificial intelligence tools to be able to make these separations more accurately. So in summary, over the last 2 years, basically, we built up this program of origin determination for Fei-Troy jade to separate Guatemalan material from Burmese material. Unfortunately, this requires pretty high-tech instrumentation, so that laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer I showed is about a $400,000 instrument altogether and can only really be applied very well in a kind of a high-tech advanced gemological laboratory. It'd be nice if we could do this with more kind of traditional gemological techniques, but at the moment it doesn't seem feasible. The other part of this, though, is that you need an extensive reference data collection to be able to do this. So it took us a lot of the time we spent on this origin determination project was simply done with building up the collection, going out to people who had reliable collections, trying to get stones that were as reliable as possible with their provenance so that we could actually collect the data and do these separations. And then finally, the research is currently in progress on trying to confidently separate these additional sources from the Burmese and Guatemalan material. So for that, I'll leave it here. This is a photo of me in Burma, but not at the jade mines. It's the closest I could get. This is in Mogok in 2019, I believe. So thanks for your attention, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.